to the Philip DeFranco Show. You daily dive into the news. It's Wednesday and we've got a lot to talk about today. But first, an exciting announcement. I just launched my brand new podcast, Crashing Out with Philip DeFranco and Alex Perlman. Right? And it's a weekly Wednesday show in addition to this daily one that I'm doing where, if the Philip DeFranco Show is 90% news and 10% reaction and opinion, this new show, it's kind of the inverse of that, which I know a vocal minority of y'all have really been wanting. So, hey, go subscribe to the YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. It's in the top links in the description and the comments. The first episode is now up. You should watch or listen after today's show. But that said, we have a lot to talk about in the here and now, starting with this. It's official. The government is shut down. The Dems, they had a proposal to fund the government until October 31st, but their version had provisions to permanently extend enhanced ACA health insurance premium subsidies and restore nearly $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts. But that got shut down with no Republicans voting for it. Right, and then Senate Dems voted against a GOP bill to keep the government funded at the current levels for a few more weeks until a long-term spending deal could be reached. With that getting a vote of 55 to 45, though of course that failed to break the 60-vote filibuster. And it also was an entire side for, entire side against, that was very close. You had 3 Democrats joining Republicans and voting in favor of the legislation and 1 Republican voting against. And all of this, it kind of felt inevitable. Because, well, there's often a lot of back and forth and everyone's concerned about the government shutting down. Like, especially here, it seemed like neither side was going to give in to demands. Because, well, Democrats, they said, we're not going to support any legislation that doesn't roll back Medicaid cuts and extend key Obamacare subsidies. You also had Republicans refusing to negotiate or make concessions. And so now with the shutdown actually happening, we've seen both sides continuing to point fingers at one another. And, while this blame game thing is pretty common, this time it is also a bit different, right? You have experts noting that we're witnessing the Trump administration do things that they've never seen before. Right? We've seen numerous agencies and their leaders joining in on the blame game and using official channels funded by taxpayer dollars to do so. And maybe one of the most notable examples was the Department of Housing and Urban Development, right, which currently has a massive banner on the homepage of their official government website that reads, "The radical left in Congress shut down the government. HUD will use available resources to help Americans in need." And that was also echoed in public statements from other agencies, like the Department of Veterans Affairs also issuing a partisan statement ahead of the shutdown saying, "Radical liberals in Congress are trying to shut down the government to achieve their crazy fantasy of open borders, transgender for everybody, and men competing in women's sports." Right, and that, as you had DHS Secretary Kristi Noem writing, "The Democrats will be forcing over 150,000 officers and nearly 50,000 members of the military, our front line of defense, to continue protecting our nation without pay." And it's also been widely reported that employees across numerous departments have received various iterations of an email from the White House Office of Management and Budget saying that a shutdown would be the fault of congressional Democrats. Right, and me saying this to you, you're probably like, okay, I'm not surprised, but it is a standout thing. Executive agencies and their leaders are usually not sharing these kinds of partisan messages. And in addition to ethics experts saying they've never seen anything like this, many have also argued that both the public statements and the internal communications appear to run up against federal lobbying laws and may even violate the Hatch Act, right, a federal statute that limits the political activities of federal employees and bans civil servants in the executive branch from engaging in most political activity while on duty. And so that it's its own messy battle. It's kind of just playing out on its own. But also, as far as how Trump himself has responded, the president, at least as of recording, has been unusually quiet. But he really hasn't given any kind of public comment or even made one of his kind of all caps posts on Truth Social. But that is, there are plenty of people doing the job for him. Right? The official White House X account, it's been going balls to the walls, putting out tons of posts blaming Democrats for the shutdown, mocking Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and repeating the false claim pushed by many Republicans that Democrats are the ones that block the Republican bill because they want to give free health care to illegal immigrants. Right? And you also had J.D. Vance going on the offensive and echoing those narratives in an interview with Fox and Friends this morning.
But let's step back for a second, because I think it's important for the American people to realize that the far left faction of Senate Democrats shut down the government because we wouldn't give them hundreds of billions of dollars for health care benefits for illegal aliens. It's actually not even all Senate Democrats. This is basically Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer, he's worried he's going to get a primary challenge from AOC, and so he's shutting down the people's government to give in to sort of the left-wing coalition and their party. And it's craziness, and people are going to suffer because of it.
Now, of course, like we talked about, his claim that Democrats want to give billions of dollars in healthcare to illegal immigrants, it's just simply untrue. Right? Illegal immigrants are ineligible for federal healthcare programs and Obamacare subsidies, and Democrats aren't trying to change that. Right? At most, one of the things that Democrats are trying to do is restore a subsidy for certain lawfully present immigrants that Republicans cut in their tax bill. But then also, beyond that, you had AOC herself hitting back at Republican attempts to somehow blame her for the shutdown.
And I saw some Republican members of Congress saying, oh, well, if we have this shutdown, it's because of AOC. Well, if that's the case, my office is open and you are free to walk in and negotiate with me directly. Because what I'm not going to do is tolerate 4 million uninsured Americans because Donald Trump decided one day that he wants to just make sure that kids are dying because they don't have access to insurance. That's what's not going to happen. And so if those senators think that we're having a shutdown because of me, they're free to enter my office and negotiate, because what we're not going to do is allow all of millions of people in this country to not be able to afford their insulin and their chemotherapies.
You're also seeing Schumer out there defending his decision to lead his party into the shutdown, arguing that this is about a fight for health care. And with that, you had Schumer saying it's the Republicans' fault that we're in a shutdown now. So you have him calling it Donald Trump's government shutdown and saying that it's the Republicans refusing to protect Americans' health care. With him adding in another post, healthcare premiums across the country are doubling and Republicans shut down the government instead of fixing it. Right? And so that's a point that we've seen many other Democrats also making. Right? Arguing that they don't trust that Republicans will actually negotiate with them in good faith if they agreed to the stopgap bill. So they need to make their all or nothing stand now. And with that, they claim that it's evidenced by the fact that Republicans refused to even negotiate with them before trying to pass this bill. And because of that, Republicans are the ones responsible for the shutdown. And you also had California Governor Gavin Newsom honing in on reports that construction on Trump's new White House ballroom is going to continue amid the shutdown, with Newsom's press office saying, Trump, Marie Antoinette says, no health care for you peasants, but a ballroom for the queen. Or basically saying he cares more about his ballroom than Americans, though according to the White House, this project is being funded by private donors. But for now, who really knows what's going to happen? Right? It's unclear how lawmakers are intending to get out of this hole and end the shutdown. I mean, today you had Republican leaders in the Senate forcing another vote on the same exact stopgap measure that failed to pass yesterday, and wouldn't you know it, it failed again. Same votes, nothing changed. And so for now, there's two kind of main battles that are playing out. One is going to be who the public blames here and how that might affect the midterms, even though that's still so far away. And two, while the government is shut down, what sort of impact do we see? Right? On agencies, on their workers, and the services that they provide. Right? Especially because we know that Trump has said that he wants to use a shutdown to fire federal workers instead of furloughing them like usual during a shutdown. And yesterday, it appeared that he said even target Democrats specifically.
When you shut it down, you have to do layoffs. So we'd be laying off a lot of people that are going to be very affected, and the Democrats, they're going to be Democrats.
Now today you had a reporter asking Vance about those comments, and he responded,
we're not targeting federal agencies based on politics. We're targeting the people's government so that as much as possible of the essential services can continue to function. Let's be honest. If this thing drags on for another few days, or God forbid another few weeks, we are going to have to lay people off. We're going to have to save money in some places so the essential services don't get turned off in other places.
But also at the same press conference, you had Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt seemingly contradicting Vance's claim that there would only be layoffs if the shutdown dragged on.
Unfortunately, because the Democrats shut down the government, the president has directed his cabinet, and the Office of Management and Budget is working with agencies across the board to identify where cuts can be made, and we believe that layoffs are imminent. They are, unfortunately, a consequence of this government shutdown.
So this is a very fluid situation. It's one that's going to change as the shutdown drags on. And for now, I'd really love to know your thoughts, opinions, and reactions. But then next up in the news, are drug prices about to get a lot lower for Americans? With that, it's what many are asking after President Trump promised just that yesterday in an announcement with the head of Pfizer saying,
A major reason is that the American consumers have been subsidizing research and development costs for the entire planet. They put all of that on us, and yet they were the beneficiaries too.
Right, and then you had Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla adding,
I think today we are turning the tide and we are reversing an unfair situation.
and while this is going to apparently affect Medicaid pricing, the news that really grabbed a lot of people's attention was the government-run pharmacy TrumpRx.gov. Though I wouldn't head over there yet because the website doesn't actually lead anywhere, and it's not expected to until at least 2026. But Trump, he claimed that direct consumer pharmacy for those without insurance would lead to reductions of 14, 15, 1,600%. So to be clear, that is Trump math and not real math, because a reduction of 1,600% would mean that you would be getting paid by the government to get pharmaceuticals. And so later they clarified that this could be upwards of a 50% discount. Right? And so with this, all of this, it sounds great on the surface, but you have many experts saying, the devil is in the details. Right? And currently we know pretty much none of the details, other than this would be for people without insurance currently. And so one, if as explained, this could be obviously great news. So this also is, two, it might not be a widespread win. And that in part because you had an official anonymously telling outlets that in the end, those with insurance won't have their prices affected and will still be paying less. Not to mention that Medicaid already has relatively low pricing, so it's unclear how much this is actually going to affect them. But the whole situation that we find ourselves in before we actually see the full impact, it's not a surprise. Right? The Trump administration has not been shy about making threats to the pharmaceutical world. Earlier this year, they sent a letter to drug makers warning them that they had 60 days to lower their prices or face tariffs. And Pfizer, they ended up being the first to bend the knee, and in return, they got a 3-year grace period from any tariffs. Also, as far as we're seeing with this recent news online, online, the reaction's generally been positive, despite, this move possibly not moving much in the grand scheme. We even had Mark Cuban, who's been extremely critical of Trump and runs his own low-cost pharmacy, saying on Twitter, to the admin's credit, they have some great people working on this project. Chris Klopp knows his stuff. Cold. So does his staff. They put people first. So I give the program and what we know as of today a grade of B. And adding why not an A? The stock prices of pharmaceutical benefit managers didn't get crushed, which means so far no one expects much change for them. Now also, as far as the reaction online, you have some kind of mocking Trump about this whole thing. Right in that, because a government-run business is kind of maybe more in line with progressive policies than right-wing ones. But as many have also pointed out, it's not really so black and white. And in many cases, right-wing governments also have embraced government control of businesses as a means of control. But again, as we often say on this show, and as is very important in life, words are words and actions are actions, and we're gonna have to see what happens here, though we fully won't see that until 2026. And so personally, I'm just kind of left hoping that whatever the result is, Americans should be getting life-saving pharmaceuticals for cheaper. If that ends up being the actual result, it's something that I'll cheer on. But this world has also trained me to be, if not cynical, at least skeptical. And so I'll always at least be that. And then there's even more that we've got to dive into. But first, let me say, have you ever had earbuds so bad that they make you want to just listen to silence instead? Because listen up, today's sponsor, Raycon, they're having an anniversary sale, which means that they're essentially them, and you should too. But then next up in the news today, the war between Donald Trump and Harvard University just entered the "you're totally full of shit" stage. And, just a quick refresher to talk about today. Back in April, the White House accused Harvard of allowing anti-Semitism to flourish on campus, and they issued a list of demands, including enforcing so-called viewpoint diversity. Harvard then refused, so the White House froze over $2 billion in research grant funding. They tried to ban all international students from attending and threatened Harvard's accreditation status. And all of this, it's been getting sorted out in the courts for months, but now it's being reported that Harvard wrote a 28-page letter basically calling Trump out on his bullshit, right? Because at the center of this is an investigation by the Health Department's Office of Civil Rights, which has been used as the justification for everything that the administration's done. But according to this letter, the evidence in that probe is paper thin, and it ignores the other evidence that points in the other direction, right? So for example, the so-called evidence reportedly includes anonymous posts on the third-party app SideChat, which Harvard isn't even affiliated with, as well as a survey from 0.5% of the student body, which the letter says HHS drew sweeping conclusions from. And in fact, it claims that the only specific incident that, if true, would show anti-Semitism disrupted a student's access to education wasn't a first-hand account. Or supposedly, it was an anonymous account from a single student who alleged that, quote, other students stopped going to a class because those other students did not feel safe. Right, and that incident didn't even come from the health department's investigation. It came from Harvard's own probe into itself. Now, HHS did cite another incident of apparent anti-Semitism, but it too is less simple than it appears. The claim is that an Orthodox Jewish student reported her mezuzah had gone missing from her dorm door. You had Harvard noting that it was found in the hallway 3 doors down, suggesting that it fell off the door because the adhesive tape gave way. And hell, even the student herself, though she believed that there was an act of anti-Semitism, penned an op-ed for the U.S. News and World Report saying her experience should not be used to justify defunding the university. Writing, no one from the administration ever contacted me to discuss what happened. No one from Washington asked what would make me feel safer at school or what policies might help Jewish students on campus. Now, with all that said, right, whether Harvard's policies around anti-Semitism could be improved, that's not really in dispute. Right? Even the university admits it's not perfect, but it also argues that imperfection isn't the same as illegal. And specifically here, for a Title VI violation, which is what the White House is alleging, 5 things would have to be proven in court. The harassment of members of a protected class was severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. That harassment denied students access to education. Harvard had actual knowledge of it. It happened within the university's programs or activities, and Harvard's response was clearly unreasonable. But in Harvard's letter, Harvard argues that 0 of those conditions were actually met, with it pointing out that even for the pro-Palestine encampment on campus last year, that was temporary, mitigated without concessions to the activists, and did not block students' access to education. Right, and that is the university citing its active reporting system, sanctions against pro-Palestine student groups, and the termination of employees involved in allegedly anti-Semitic conduct as evidence of a good faith response. Right, if anything, the university, it paints the government as acting in bad faith, noting it chided Harvard for failing to hand over documents that it never actually requested. They also pointed out the apparent contradiction in using Harvard's own investigation into itself as evidence that Harvard's not taking anti-Semitism seriously enough. And then, according to Harvard, the health department referred it to the Justice Department before even giving Harvard guidelines to come into compliance. And well, apparently, at least one federal judge agrees, because earlier this month, she ruled that the funding freeze was illegal and rebuked the White House for ignoring Harvard's concrete actions to comply with federal law. But despite all that, on Monday, HHS referred Harvard Harvard to the federal suspension and debarment process. And if you get debarred, you're basically blacklisted. You can't get any more funding or contracts from any federal agencies. And that, it would be an enormous hit for the university, which got 11% of its operating budget from federal research dollars last year. But then, just a day after HHS took that step, you had Trump saying that his administration is close to striking a deal with Harvard.
We're in the process of getting very close, and Linda's finishing up the final details, and they'd be paying about $500 million, and they'll be operating trade schools. They're going to be teaching people how to do AI and lots of other things, engines, lots of things. You know, we need people in trade schools.
And so we're getting contradictory signals about where things actually stand with Trump and Harvard right now. But also, this is just one facet of Trump's war on higher education. But on another front, we got news from a federal court yesterday where a Reagan-appointed judge ruled that Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and Secretary of State Marco Rubio violated the First Amendment by targeting pro-Palestinian students for deportation. Or with the judge also specifically calling out Trump, writing, "The president's palpable misunderstanding that the government simply cannot seek retribution for speech he disdains poses a great threat to Americans' freedom of speech." And in a chilling sign of the times, he attached a threat that he had received via postcard at the very top of the ruling, with it reading, "Trump has pardons and tanks, what do you have?" To which the judge responded, "Alone, I have nothing but my sense of duty. Together, we the people of the United States, you and me, have our magnificent Constitution." But then next up, in the news, we need to talk about the abortion pill, right? And that in part because a new study shows that it might be more important to reproductive health care than ever, but it's also under attack. And that also is, maybe over the past day or so, you've seen the headlines, but for the first time since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, abortions in the United States decline, right? And those numbers come from the Guttmacher Institute, which just published research finding that nearly 519,000 clinician-provided abortions happened in the first 6 months of 2025 in states without total abortion bans. So you're looking at a 5% drop compared to the same time last year. And then on top of that, travel for abortions to states without total bans declined by 8% over the same time, which might lead you to believe that abortions are down nationwide, though it's also not that simple, because Guttmacher only collected data from providers who can give in-person and online care in states without bans. So what that means is that self-managed abortions weren't counted. Neither were those who got abortion pills from community networks or other online means, and most importantly here, it does not count abortion pills that clinicians in shield law states mailed to patients in abortion ban states. Right? In shield laws, they're one of the most crucial access points for abortion care right now. And if you're not familiar with this, several blue states passed these shield laws explicitly allowing providers to remotely prescribe and mail abortion pills to patients no matter where they are in the 50 states, and then make sure that they're protected from out-of-state prosecution. So what that means is that a doctor in a shield law state, let's say California or New York, they can prescribe the pill to someone in a state where abortion is totally banned, and that patient, they don't have to leave their state to get care. Right? And they can do that all from home, and these laws, they started popping up in 2023 following Roe's reversal, and they've really changed how abortions can work in the country. So with that in mind, you had a senior research associate at Guttmacher telling Time magazine that this study does not necessarily reflect abortion rates nationwide, but instead highlights that shield laws, I think, are a critical option that people are making use of. But also here, I think it's worth noting that different states had different stories. Right? Florida, they used to be crucial for abortion care in the South, accounting for 1 out of every 3 abortions in the area, but since the state enacted a 6-week ban in May of last year, that is no longer the case. Right? There was a 27% drop in clinician-provided abortions in the first half of the year compared to last year. And that drop, it accounted for more than 40% of the national abortion decrease. Right? And Florida's ban also likely contributed to an increase in travel to New York for abortions, which clashed with the national trend of travel going down. And with that, you had the study also noting that the decline in out-of-state travel for abortions significantly contributed to the overall state-level declines in abortions. Right? And again, noting that shield laws allow people to get care without traveling, and some estimate that the amount of abortions provided via these laws increased between the beginning and end of 2024. So you had that senior research associate adding, "This is an innovation of the last couple of years that I think has been incredibly important, and it's important that policymakers and advocates continue to protect and expand these provisions because it's clear that they've been incredibly important to the abortion access landscape in the US. But of course, a really huge thing is that those shield laws cannot work without the pill, which is the most common method of abortion. Right? And so with that, you have many arguing that this just underlines the importance of the pill and the laws protecting them. But the pill, it's facing some questioning from RFK Jr., who just last week announced that the FDA is launching a safety review of mifepristone, which is one of the 2 drugs commonly taken for medication abortions. Right? And that is a big thing because there are already over 100 studies that have concluded that the drug is both safe and effective. But still, he's pushing forward with a review due to a non-peer-reviewed report from a conservative policy center that's gotten a lot of attention from Republican lawmakers. And so with that, you had many, including Axios, noting that if the FDA enacts new restrictions to the pill, those could potentially include in-person prescriptions, which would then prevent those in abortion ban states from getting the drug via telehealth and shield laws. Now that said, you do have some thinking that there's a chance that nothing actually comes from this review, that RFK Jr. is just simply doing this to buy time to appease conservative AGs across the country who have been pressuring him about the pill. But this also, as you had one advocate arguing, this is political interference designed to rip away our freedoms, with California's Attorney General calling the review unnecessary and baseless, and some fearing it could get the Tylenol treatment. But ultimately, we're gonna have to wait to see where this goes. And in the meantime, I'd really love to know your thoughts, opinions, reactions, and maybe even your experiences with this over the past 2 years, let's say, whether it be firsthand or secondhand. And then we've got more we got to dive into. But first, let me say, WhatsApp literally said, "We're secure," and hackers basically went, "Hold my beer," because a newly patched flaw let attackers chain bugs in both WhatsApp and iOS to quietly steal data from targeted users. Which is exactly why I don't trust apps to keep me safe. I use today's sponsor, NordVPN, to lock down the rest of my digital life. And here's the scary part. This wasn't random. Fewer than 200 people were hit over 90 days, meaning that someone somewhere picked them out on purpose. And even secure apps can become surveillance tools overnight, and if you rely on them without backup, you're basically leaving the door wide open. But NordVPN, they deadbolt that door with strong encryption, shielding your traffic from snoops, hackers, and even your own ISP. And their Threat Protection Pro, it goes further, blocking malware, phishing sites, and trackers before they even touch your device. Add in double VPN, a kill switch, and a strict no logs policy, and you're not an easy target anymore. Whether you're worried about stalkers, coffee shop Wi-Fi creeps, or advanced campaigns, NordVPN's the extra layer you didn't know you needed. So yeah, always update your apps, but don't stop there. Protect your connection. Scan that QR code or head to nordvpn.com/Phil to get a huge discount on a 2-year plan, 4 extra months free, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/Phil. But then next up in the news, well, obviously a lot of the coverage today and this week, it's very focused on U.S. domestic news. We should also talk about this Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant situation in Russia-occupied Ukraine. Because what you had is that it was disconnected from the power grid for the past week, which actually made it the longest and most alarming of the several outages that had taken place since Russia seized the facility in the first weeks of the 2022 invasion. And even though the plant right now isn't actually producing electricity, it does need power to keep the fuel in the reactors cool and stop a meltdown from happening. And that, it's being done with the help of diesel generators because it doesn't have external power. Right? And so then with that in mind, you had Ukrainian President Zelensky claiming yesterday that the generators and the plant were not designed for this, and explaining they, quote, "have never operated in this mode for long, and we already have information that one generator has failed." And even Zelensky going on to say it is Russian shelling that prevents repair of the power lines to the plant and the restoration of basic safety, and adding, "This is a threat to everyone. No terrorist in the world has ever dared to do to a nuclear plant what Russia is doing, and it's right that the world does not stay silent." And then along with that, you had the head of Ukraine's state nuclear regulatory inspectorate saying in a statement that the current situation poses great threats to nuclear and radiation security, and that all of this could well lead to the worst case scenario. But that's also not to say that we have another Chernobyl on our hands. You've got the International Atomic Energy Agency reporting that the plant is operating 8 diesel generators with 9 units in standby mode and 3 in maintenance, and also noting that the site still has fuel reserves for more than 10 days of operation. And you've got the head of the agency saying there is no immediate danger as long as the generators keep working, but then also adding, it is clearly not a sustainable situation in terms of nuclear safety. Neither side would benefit from a nuclear accident. And so with that, you also had him saying that the IAEA was working with both sides to restore the external power, and that both sides have pointed to military activity as an obstacle to making the necessary repairs. But notably with that, Ukraine has repeatedly offered to repair a backup power line that was disconnected in early May, but Russia has declined to take them up on it. And that is, as far as Russia, the plant's Russian-installed communications director said that the situation remains under control. And then you had a spokesperson from the Kremlin pointing the finger at Ukraine, claiming the station and nearby facilities are subjected to constant attacks by the Kyiv regime, and saying it would be, to say the least, absurd to accuse the Russian side of shelling a station that it itself controls. And then actually you also had that same spokesperson slamming EU plans to build a so-called drone wall along its borders with Russia, which is also something we got to talk about because you had EU leaders gathering in Denmark today to talk about it. And they see this conversation as being increasingly urgent in light of the fact that they keep seeing more and more unidentified drones flying all over the place, right into their airspace. I mean, just talking about Denmark, several airports were closed there last week due to unexplained drone sightings. Some were even sighted over the country's largest military base. You actually had the Danish military announcing today that there will be an increased presence of foreign troops and equipment in the country, with 10 allied nations, including the United States, reportedly providing some form of anti-drone and surveillance support. But again, it's not just Denmark. There have also been unidentified drones over Sweden, Finland, Lithuania, and northern Germany. And while there's not definitive evidence of Russian involvement, European leaders fear that this is all part of Russia ramping up its hybrid war on the continent, with this also being linked to recent Russian incursions into NATO airspace, including over Poland and Estonia. And so again, with this drone wall, it wouldn't be an actual physical wall, right? It would be a network of sensors, signal jammers, and other technologies aimed at detecting, tracking, and intercepting drones. And one of the big things here is you actually had Ukraine offering up expertise that it's gained over the past few years of having to deal with Russia. So this all seemingly early stages, right? It's not clear exactly what this drone wall would look like, how much it would cost, or when it would be completed. But that's also not the only thing being talked about in the meeting in Denmark today, because it's also the first opportunity for EU leaders to actually debate a proposal to use frozen Russian assets to fund a major loan to Ukraine, which is an idea that the Kremlin has condemned as pure theft. And so you had that, as well as Russia hitting back at the news that the US is considering Ukraine's request request to sell them Tomahawk cruise missiles, which would allow Ukraine to strike as far as 1,500 miles into Russia. It's easily far enough to hit Moscow. And so a lot we're going to have to keep our eyes on, right? Whether it be conversations or activities, but we'll have to see how this plays out. But then from that, finally today, let's end with a congratulations and one last thing. Starting with congrats to Wilbur M., right? SeatGeek's latest weekly winner who just scored $500 in tickets and is gonna go see Mana. And for the rest of y'all, that's right, SeatGeek is still giving away $500 in tickets, and you should definitely enter today if you haven't already. I mean, you could be the next winner and snag $500 towards seeing your favorite artist, sporting event, or play. I mean, there's like over 70,000 events to choose from. And remember, all you gotta do is add code DeFranco to your SeatGeek app profile for a chance at the weekly.
So to lighten the mood a bit, you see the news recently, the Tucker Carlson statement.
He was dating women just a few years ago. That's totally fake. Wow. He's not gay at all.
Smart.
He said that you are basically fake gay, and that you've created this persona to appease the woke mob.
Yeah. In a weird way, I guess it's progress. There was a time when I would have done anything to not be gay.
Like you would have gone to conversion therapy?
Maybe, yeah. And then I grew older, I matured. I went to war. During that deployment, I thought, this is insane to, be a grown-ass man with no idea what it's like to be in love. If I get through this deployment okay, I'm going to come home, I'm going to come out, and if it messes up my career, so be it.
Pete Buttigieg interview.
All right. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So what's going on, man? What's on your mind?
Big question. I mean, where do you start? Now I'm really thinking a lot about where we go from here as a country, but also in my party, because we need to be able to talk in a different way about what's going to happen. That's on my mind. AI is on my mind. Preschool's on my mind. Chess and I have 4-year-olds, so I don't know where you want to begin, but there's a lot to talk about.
I mean, AI is a pretty good place to start. Are you concerned or optimistic about the future of artificial intelligence?
Yes. I mean, of course you got to be concerned, right? Because it's bringing all these upheavals and problems, but I also think there's an enormous amount of potential. I mean, one of the uses that I'm closest to is automated vehicles. This is a technology that has been developing for years and years, still not in widespread use. But when it is, if we do it right, it will save thousands and thousands of lives, if we do it right. Because human beings driving kill roughly 40,000 people a year in this country. We don't really think about it that much because we're so used to it. But the number of people who die in a car crash every day is about the same as the number of people who can fill an airplane. And if we had a plane crash every day, we'd all be up in arms, right? So the promise of something like AI in terms of safer vehicles is enormous, but we also have a lot of worries about what happens if that goes wrong. And you could say the same about medicine, you could say the same about any number of national security implications, but the thing that I think about the most is what's going to happen to our economy. Because I'm from a place in the industrial Midwest where when I was growing up, these huge changes came. It was trade, it was automation, it was a bunch of things in the 90s and 2000s. And people got left behind. And even when they found a new job, they didn't necessarily find something that fit them into their community the way that their old job in a tool and die shop or in some part of the auto industry did. And the result of that was they couldn't find the sense of belonging that they had before, and that led to this explosion of problems. Social problems, mental health problems, political problems, I would argue. The moment we're in, I think, is largely driven by that. So if that's what happened then, because of the kind of technology and things that happened in the 90s, think about the level of displacement that might be coming our way now. Today, some companies are hiring less at the entry level because of AI, and that's now. So a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, as the software gets smarter and smarter, what's going to happen to everybody? I think that's a massive problem that people in the political and policy world are not really preparing for the right way.
Yeah, because trucking is one of the biggest employers in the country. So if you were to automate all trucks and vehicles that are hauling stuff across the country, you'd have a ton of people out of jobs. So you'd have to figure out where they're going to work after that.
This is happening in transportation. It's been happening for a long time in manufacturing. But the other thing is it's happening more and more in the white collar jobs. So 15 years ago, if somebody's job was at risk in, trucking, one of the things that would happen is they would be told, well, what you should really do is you should learn coding and start working on software, which may or may not fit for that person. But if they went off and did that because society told them to, now, 15 years later, the AI is getting good at writing code. And that's one of the areas where there's questions about whether there's going to be hiring. We're talking about architecture, graphic design, law, lawyers. So white collar as well as blue collar jobs that are on the line. And I really don't think that people have absorbed that. I think when we think about AI, we're thinking so much about the doomsday scenarios, which are also a thing, right?
Yeah.
But I think we're less prepared for what is very, very likely to be on us, very soon, like by the end of this decade.
What you're talking about, mass unemployment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll be like 50% unemployment, but I do think that you'll see certain categories of jobs where suddenly like a huge chunk of the jobs, especially the entry-level ones, just aren't there. And then people who went to school and were told, study this, there's going to be a job waiting for you, and there isn't. You know, we've got to act fast to make sure that there's answers.
Yeah, I used to selfishly believe that my job was irreplaceable as a journalist, like as a street interviewer, because, you know, I have to actually talk to people in person. But then I saw an Instagram and TikTok page recently with 2 million followers or something like that, and it was all AI street interviews. And there's not a single comment saying like, what, you're taking jobs away from the real street guys, man on the street. It was all just praising the genius and the actual content within it. So it might come from my job too.
I mean, it's hard to think of a job that isn't implicated in some way. Either something about the job changes or the entire job changes.
Definitely. I mean, it's gotten to the point that they actually have AI Channel 5 episodes that they're like posting on Twitter and Instagram now.
I'm at the Abolish ICE rally. Shit is absolutely hectic. Tonight, any sign with the word ICE, from ice cream to ice machines, has become a target. Slushy machines are being drained. Everybody is slipping. What the fuck is going on?
Reddit told me I'm literally fighting Hitler.
These niggas are absolutely insane. Where the fuck is the Kirkinator?
Sir, the Antifa has hit the second McDonald's ice cream machine.
Pookie, wake up. We got a problem.
Activating ocular sport shield.
So to lighten the mood a bit, you see the news recently, the Tucker Carlson statement.
He's never agreed to interview, but I'm going to ask him like some very specific questions about gay sex and see if he can even answer.
He said that you are basically fake gay and that you've created this persona to appease the woke mob.
Tucker Carlson claims Pete Buttigieg isn't really gay.
He was dating women just a few years ago. That's totally fake. He's not gay at all.
Smart.
So I said that on the air. People got all offended.
Yeah. I mean, in a weird way, I guess it's progress. Like, I spent a good chunk of my life believing, knowing that, like, being gay would be a career ender for me. I had two parts of my career when I was in my 20s. Public service and being interested in public office and being in the military, both of which could have ended because I was gay. And I don't like thinking about it now, but there was a time when I would have done anything to not be gay. Like, it was just like, tell me what I have to do, and I would have done it.
Like you would have gone to conversion therapy?
I mean, if I thought it would have worked, the state of mind that I was in at a certain time in my life when I was younger, maybe, yeah. Because I thought that the reality would just shut down my options. And then I grew older, I matured, I went to war. During that deployment, I thought, like, this is insane to, like, be a grown-ass man with no idea what it's like to be in love. Like, if I get through this deployment okay, I'm going to come home, I'm going to come out, and if it messes up my career, so be it. But that's how I live my life. And so to now be at a point where a right-wing, whatever you want to call him, personality, commentator, his big conspiracy theory is that I'm secretly straight is, like, kind of hilarious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's progress.
Yeah, because what would you possibly have to gain about lying about that?
Yeah, I don't know. But that's the nature of these conspiracy things, right? I mean, you know these much more deeply than I do, but I think it doesn't have to make sense in order for it to make sense to someone. And what is important is to say something that's, like, outrageous enough to get attention. And, like, here we are talking about it, because it's actually, like, of all the things you could say about me being gay, probably the most, like, novel and weird is to say that I'm actually not.
I didn't know that you didn't come out until after your deployment.
Yeah, I was already mayor in South Bend, and part of what happened is when you get deployed, you write a letter, or they tell you to write a letter, just in case. I mean, I still have it in my desk drawer. It says just in case on the outside. And I'm sitting down to write this letter that's for my family to open up if I don't make it. And I'm taking stock of all these great things in my life, which really are these great things in my life. I mean, I'd become the mayor of this city that I loved. I owned a home, you know, like I had a good life, great friends. But, like, this huge part of what most people consider to be important in their lives just wasn't there for me, because I had figured out long since that I was gay, and I didn't think I could or should, like, try to date and keep it a secret. So I just didn't have that as part of my life. And sitting down writing that letter, I just thought, I can't, you know, I'm already into my 30s, like, I can't go on like that. So that's kind of when I made up my mind. And not about being gay, but about coming out.
For sure. And you feel like that was a really important thing for you to do?
Yeah, and it opened up so many things in my life. I mean, pretty soon after that, I met Chasten, who I married. We're now raising 2 kids together in Michigan, where we live. And I just think about all of the most important things in my life, like our family and our home, and none of that's there in a world where I don't just decide whatever the consequences, I'm gonna come out, be who I am, start dating, and like have that part of my life.
So you expected some initial backlash, but it actually went the opposite direction.
Yeah, there was both. There was definitely both. I mean, as soon as I came out, there were people having press conferences denouncing me for whatever, but as some like nasty stuff online. But also, what was interesting was a lot of people did surprise me with their reaction in the other way. Some people like just found it, especially people I was in the military with, like just found a reason to say hi. Didn't say anything other than that, but it was kind of a way of like checking in, or kind of a way of letting me know they didn't care. And then other people, including people I was in the military with, it turned out I was in the same boat, and I never knew it. And they wrote to let me know that. And I got reelected, it's actually that same year, with more votes than I did the first time around. And this is in, like, Indiana's a conservative place, right? This is while Mike Pence is the governor of Indiana, like, just to give you a sense of how conservative. And it was okay. Like, not perfect, but it was okay.
Was there any reaction that really surprised you in a positive way?
One story I tell a lot is someone I ran into who, pretty soon after I started dating Chasten, who I knew was like more conservative. I ran into her and she had this like almost like naughty look in her eye, and she's like, I ran into your friend and he's fantastic. And it was like this like moment of like, I could have lectured her on like, this isn't my friend, but like the point was like, she wanted me to know that she was like in this accepting place, right? Which I thought was really, really moving, because I was like honestly pretty terrified about how many people would or wouldn't be accepting. The other thing that was surprising is that it wound up being this thing that I was afraid would just like make me like other, just like alien to like the world I grew up in, which is like a very like straight conservative culture. It actually became the most normal thing in my life. Like what was not normal was being somebody who worked 18 hours a day and didn't miss that he didn't have any kind of like dating life, right? That might have been how I looked or like tried to look normal, but that's not normal. What's much more normal actually is now where like I'm trying to have a presence as a public figure and a political life, and also trying to do right by a home where I got a husband waiting for me and 2 kids and a dog, and we're getting the roof fixed, and like some of the most normal things in my life are there because I opened that door.
Yeah.
And maybe that's been the biggest surprise.
Yeah, speaking of Mike Pence, do you think there's a pipeline between like homophobia and people being closeted?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you see these stories about like apps like Grindr like blowing up when the RNC comes to town and all the Republicans are in one place, right?
Yeah.
And look, I think a lot of people, even now, I'd like to think it's different than when I was in high school, but I think even now a lot of people get the message that like you don't get to just be who you are and not have that define you. And that's the part I think we're still really working on in the gay community, is like being able to have that just be like a thing that's like true about you among advocates and activists who were transgender in the 60s or 70s. I mean, it's hard enough now. Imagine what it was like then.
Can't even imagine.
Who stuck up for everybody's rights. And so, I get the politics of it. Like, I get that it would be politically convenient, honestly, for like people to pull up the ladder after them and leave out others, but that's not okay. Like, people have to stick together. And that's not just across the LGBTQ community. It's like anywhere somebody is getting beat up or having, literally or figuratively, because of who they are, I think everybody else has to stick up for them.
Going back to the very beginning, you said you grew up pretty conservative, yeah?
I grew up in a conservative state.
Okay.
I didn't grow up in a conservative household.
Okay, so your parents were Democrats?
Yeah, they were definitely left of center.
Right.
I think they were kind of skeptical of the Democratic Party too, but they were people who really cared about what was going on. The news, TV was always tuned to the news. My dad was always reading the paper. Like, I grew up with a sense that the most important things are the things that are happening in public life that kind of affect us all. We were politically connected. Like, I don't think I like met an elected official when I was growing up, but we were very politically aware. And so that was something that made me always feel a little bit at odds with my surroundings, because our household was liberal, our community in a lot of ways was not.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned too there kind of touches on what's going on in New York right now. You mentioned a bit of skepticism with the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And right now we're in New York City. There's a pretty contentious mayoral election. What's really not that contentious. You have an overwhelming groundswell of support between 18 and 32, especially in this neighborhood for Mamdani, who's kind of considered to be the front runner.
Yeah.
Yet you don't really see too many Democratic politicians openly supporting him. What's your stance on what's going on?
I think he's doing so well because he's focused on the issues people care about, like affordability. And I think that's what we as a party should be doing. Look, there are things he's going to say and that he's going to do that are going to make more sense in a Democratic primary in New York than like a general election in Indiana or even a Democratic primary in Indiana. And that's just like politics are different in different places. But the core of his message, which is to focus on affordability, I think is the right message. I think also, you know, you see these maneuvers like the Trump administration apparently trying to put a thumb on the scale of election by getting Eric Adams a new job so he'll get out and clear the way for Cuomo. That's everything that people hate about politics, no matter like where they are politically. And I think it's just supercharging people's frustration with that.
But why is there the hesitancy to endorse him explicitly?
I think there's a lot of folks who aren't so sure about what he's said about the Middle East or some of his positions that are economically pretty far left. And a lot of people who think of themselves as Democrats still aren't there on those issues. You know, I also do think that my party should learn from the focus on everyday life, which I think is part of why he's been successful, and the style, the approach of just like getting out there and talking to everybody.
Yeah, I think that specifically anti-Trump rhetoric is kind of falling on deaf ears, especially with my generation, which I guess is Gen Z, mainly because most people, I'm 28 right now, I don't know a single person who owns a home.
Wow.
You know, and I've lived in California, in Pennsylvania, and Washington, Seattle. Yeah. Everybody's still renting. Most people are working 2 to 3 jobs. Everybody's overworked. And then at the same time, I'm being told, you know, we open our phones and we see horrible videos and imagery of things happening in the Middle East. And then we're told that we're supposed to direct our anger toward Trump. And obviously, there's not a huge, big support of Trump in my generation, especially in the city. But most people aren't waking up furious about the president every day. They're furious about economic circumstances in their day-to-day life.
I think it's got to be both. Like, it's really important to stand up to these things that are happening, like the president sending military troops to militarize American cities, or like any other, we can go down the list. But yeah, I think especially if you're in a place where like not being on board with Trump is kind of a given, then like you can't use that to end the conversation. Like that's like a background of the conversation. What people really want to hear from the opposition or from Democrats is like, okay, what are you going to do? Look, I can make the case, and I will all day, for things that my party has done or tried to do that are going to be better for everyday life. But it's also clear that just collectively, as a country, like the experience of young people is policy failure. Right? Like, you're supposed to be able to at least hope to purchase your home. And that's not happening. And I have a whole set of ideas about things I think would help on that. But I think you're right. Like, I get that, like, people only want to hear it so much about Trump if you don't have something that at least feels like a plausible answer on how you're going to be able to afford to get a home, or how you're going to be able to afford to get an education, or like what your outlook is in life in terms of a job that's actually going to get you there.
And it's also just like, we know that our tax revenue is going to the government. Everybody, we go to urgent care, we have a doctor's appointment, we have to pay $500 to $1,000 for anything beyond a basic checkup. And we're simultaneously seeing that money that was involuntarily being sent to regimes that we generally disagree with as a generation. So there's kind of this fatigue. And I think that the Democrat Party will have to lean a little bit more progressive to get young voters for next election, at least next primary.
I think we got to speak to what's on young voters' minds. And yeah, we got to do more listening, right? Which is, I mean, it sounds obvious, but like, I don't think there's a sense that that's happened. And the conversation has been I think the party, any political party, but definitely mine, like, has a tendency to get into these very inside baseball conversations, and people don't see themselves in it. What I'm trying to lay out is a case for how it doesn't have to be this way. We can make it better, but we have to make certain policy choices. Like, we have to decide that wages have to be a certain level you can actually live on. We actually have to decide to change certain things so it's easier to build housing, because if we build more housing, housing will become more affordable. We have to decide what our healthcare policy is. And yeah, part of that is anti-Trump, because Trump, like, ripping out Medicaid and making your premiums go up by getting rid of the Obamacare subsidies makes healthcare more expensive for you. We also have to explain what we're going to do to make it less expensive for you. We got to explain what it means to have a child care policy where, like, you have a kid, you can afford to have a kid, and you can get paid family leave that every other country has. But what I'm saying is that's not something where you can throw up your hands and say both sides are not doing anything. We're like, Republicans have stopped paid family leave in this country. Democrats are trying to get it done, and if we had enough power, we would.
Yeah.
So there's a set of things where I believe right now that we have the right position. And there's other things where we need to do some listening and some rethinking about our policy commitments.
There's just this generational nihilism that's set in. And I don't know if it was Obama that triggered that, but there's been all these moments of hope where it seems like things are heading in a positive direction, yet the baseline remains more or less the same. What are some imminent policy changes you think would trend things in the opposite direction?
Well, again, my point is it doesn't have to be this way. Like, we don't have to settle for this. Politics is messy, and it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and people disappoint you, and it can suck. But it is the only way to make things better. And when you get it right, things do, in fact, get better. Like, there are a lot of people in my life who went from not being able to have any health insurance before Obama to they have health insurance now. There's more problems with the healthcare system, for sure. We went from no insurance to insurance. People like me went from not able to get married to able to get married in the short span of my adult lifetime, right? So things can get better if we make them better. So what are the biggest things we want to make better? Cost of living, right? Wages in many cases. Access to things like those family policies I'm talking about, like paid leave. A lot of things about education need to get better. Like I said earlier with AI, like we need policies that make sure that if AI is going to change the way your job works or change your job or cost you your job, that doesn't mean that you can't recover. Making sure that things like your healthcare are less connected to your job if you don't want them to be. Like if you're going to change jobs 13 times in your career, which the younger you are, the more likely that's going to happen, then you should have an option that isn't to have your health insurance change every time that happens.
Like switching from Blue Shield to a different one. Is that what you're talking about? Just like the annoying clerical process of having to switch insurance providers.
Yeah, and it's not just the clerical process, right? It's the uncertainty and the fear. If you're not sure the new one has different benefits than the old one, or you're not sure your new employer has good coverage, like that's why there need to be alternatives. I think the government should provide alternatives. I don't think government should force you into any plan, but I think there should be one that you can get that is still yours, whatever your job is. And you should be able to afford it. My point is, there's this tendency to like throw up our hands and say all of this sucks because everybody's failed. But there are real, very major, important differences between how the two sides are approaching this. And you got one side that is taking the money out of healthcare and putting it into tax cuts for the rich. And you got another side that wants to make sure that the wealthy pay their share and then use it for things like healthcare. Like that's a real difference. And if you stay home, you're kind of choosing the first group.
And I think that's back to what I was saying originally. All those points are why so many young people, especially in New York, resonate with Mamdani and the message that he is delivering, because he kind of plans to address most of those things. Rent freeze, pausing the insane cycle of Airbnb gentrification, making it so people can afford basic groceries at city-run stores and be able to not have to, steal eggs. But there's probably someone stealing eggs right now near us.
Well, what it's going to come down to is results, right? Look, I was a young mayor that a lot of people said, like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
But I got enough people to form a coalition to believe that the trajectory of our city should change and could change. To try to explain a little bit about what our city was up against. So we were a company town for Studebaker. Studebaker was a car company. It was a major car company. Like it was on par with the big three until it shut down in the 60s. And even though that happened like 2 decades before I was born, it was still everywhere around us when I was growing up, like collapsing factory buildings all over. And 30 years after that, when I was running for mayor, people were still trying to like go back to some past glory days. And my message was, it doesn't have to be this way. We can do something different. But then the day I won, the day I took office as a 29-year-old mayor, then it was just all about results. And that's when that's when the rubber meets the road and it catches out for people.
Yeah.
Like, can you deliver or not?
So to get kind of surgical with the exact disagreements that, establishment Democrats have with Mamdani's platform. So you said it's Middle East and it's also some of the far left economic policies. What are those economic policies that are kind of red flags for the center?
First of all, you have a group that even now is just like frightened of the word socialism, right?
Socialism.
And he has identified himself as a socialist. You have, obviously, the language around the Middle East. Like, you got to understand, with something like globalize the Intifada, like, a lot of Jews understand that to mean open season on Jews.
Open hunting season on Jews.
I don't think that's what it means to him. He's, like, taken steps to clarify that. But that's for that. And his job, not just as a candidate, but definitely his job as mayor, will be to bring together people in a city who share the city and don't share a lot of other things in terms of their values, their worldview, or their experience. On the economic front, I think a lot of folks are skeptical about a government-run grocery store, just because if you look at the grocery business, there are a lot of businesses where there's tons of like profits sloshing around. You could say that in pharma, you could say that in a lot of businesses, right? Groceries operate on a very tight margin. So if you're proposing to make groceries more affordable, if you're saying you're going to subsidize food, that can make sense, right? We do subsidize food. That's what food stamps and SNAP are all about. Although, that's something else that Trump is actively getting rid of. His budget is cutting SNAP, right? But if you're saying it's going to be better because the store is run by the government, I think a lot of folks are skeptical about why that would be better.
I guess maybe the process of applying for food stamps is, maybe just annoying for people. And then also there's the likelihood of it getting denied, especially if it's in the hands of the federal government.
So that's something that is really important, like people's access to the benefits that they've earned. And that happens with food stamps. That happens with Medicaid. Remember, the people who are cutting Medicaid right now say that they're not cutting Medicaid. They say, hey, all we're doing is making sure that you're eligible. But what they're really doing is they're putting up so many pieces of red tape, so many steps that you have to go through to prove you're eligible, that a lot of people are going to fall out. And we know that's true because this happened in Arkansas. They did this exact move. And what happened was they said this is just about making sure that you can only get Medicaid if you're supposed to. What actually happened is a bunch of people who are supposed to aren't getting their care. So I agree on that. The system, the structure needs to be better. I just think a lot of folks are skeptical that having a business of that kind or an operation of that kind owned and operated by the government is going to work. But again, you win, you get a chance to prove it.
All right, so Pete here probably knows more about infrastructure than anybody else alive. But infrastructure isn't just about roads and bridges. It's digital too. And your digital infrastructure is most likely full of potholes. Every click, every search, every late night Amazon impulse buy gets scooped up by data brokers who are quietly selling it off like prime real estate to the highest bidder. These companies don't just know what shoes you wear or what apps you download. They know your location history, your family members' emails, and what time you usually scroll Zillow and where. They're mapping you out like a city grid, and that's no cap. For all these reasons, that's why I use Incogni. Think of it like a Department of Transportation for your personal data, except instead of fixing potholes, they're ripping up sketchy billboards that are plastered with your private info. Here's how it works. You sign up, and then Incogni sends official removal requests to data broker sites on your behalf. They don't just ask politely either. They push back when companies try to hold on to your information and play dumb. For me, that meant 80+ brokers wiped clean. The robocalls stopped overnight. The spam emails slowed down gradually, and suddenly it felt like my digital city just banned billboards. Peace at last. And Incogni just rolled out a new feature, custom removals. You know those creepy people search sites that list your old addresses, your cousin's names, and your high school mascot? With Incogni's unlimited and family unlimited plans, you can point to any one of these sites and say, get this off the internet, and Incogni takes care of the rest. If you want to sign up, here's what you got to do. Go to incogni.com/channel5 and use code channel5 for 60% off your annual plan. That's incogni.com/channel5, promo code channel5, or just click the link below. If you don't want your personal life auctioned off to the highest bidder, if you don't want to be reduced to a folder labeled single male 18 to 35 in some corporate basement server, get Incogni. Protect your data. Rebuild your digital infrastructure before somebody else paves right over it. Nah, but for real, supporting Incogni supports us and keeps Channel 5 alive and corporate surveillance free. All right, y'all, back to Mayor Pete. So you have the word socialism scaring people, and it sounds like a huge thing is Israel-Palestine.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on that stuff?
Well, I'm going to put my coffee down. There's so many things that have to be said, and what I've learned is if you don't say all of them, people think you're abandoning them. So here's some things in no particular order that I know. I know that there are unspeakable horrors taking place in Gaza. I know that those unspeakable horrors are something that was unleashed by a war that started with unspeakable horrors being perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th.
Well, I mean, that wasn't the beginning of the conflict.
Of course. I mean, this goes back to 47 and it goes back before 47. But this is exactly my point. Right. The moment you say anything about, the moment I talk about disgust at babies being put in ovens and people being flayed by Hamas on October 7th, somebody says, well, you're not talking about the history of the Nakba and what happened with the displacement of Palestinians. And the moment I express disgust at watching people in Gaza being starved, somebody says, well, you must be excusing what happened with Hamas. No.
Yeah.
Now, there is nothing intrinsically anti-Semitic about speaking up for the rights of Palestinians. At the same time, a lot of people I know who lie awake at night worried about their kids going to college or walking the streets, hear expressions of support for Palestinian civilian life and think about the fact that even though nothing about that makes you soft on anti-Semitism, the experience has been that those two things, expressions of support for Palestinian civilian life and expressions of anti-Semitism, have sometimes traveled together because there is, in fact, an explosion of anti-Semitism going on in this country.
Here at Harvard, it's easily one of America's most anti-Semitic, hateful universities.
I was one of the students who was doxxed after October 7th. There was like a student letter that 34 student organizations signed, and that ended up causing a huge global kind of uproar, and there were trucks and names and stuff leaked to the public in terms of who signed. My name's right there.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Damn. The perspective of our generation is it's really a matter of scale and mobility. Because obviously it's not good for someone to be targeted in an anti-Semitic tirade on a college campus. But you look at, 65,000 plus civilians killed in Gaza, and then you think about somebody getting harassed on a college campus, and it just doesn't seem like a fair shake to balance one and say, someone's at Harvard, and there's protesters who are hurting someone's feelings versus people who can't leave, stuck in an open air prison, haven't been able to leave since 2005. They're getting shot indiscriminately in aid lines. They want sovereignty. Even if you want to go all the way back, Israel was supporting Hamas through Qatar as a way to weaken the leadership in the West Bank because they knew that Arafat and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority was a more secular organization with less radical goals. So now we're in this position that, and I would call it the Gaza genocide. That's what I would call it. We can't believe that our tax money is going to this war that we don't consent to funding. And we have to wake up every day in this unaffordable reality. And thankfully, I've been successful, but I still can't even afford a house because I just realized that 10% is actually the down payment. I don't have 10% liquid capital to put down. So I'm already have exceeded. And so it's just it's a bad situation.
Look, I feel all of that. I also think it's a mistake to say that the reason that housing is unaffordable here is because we're aiding countries. The same, Trump and Vance try to do this with Ukraine, right? The reason we need to cut off Ukraine is because we could use that money better at home. But if you look at what's actually happening with the money here at home, it's not like every dollar that comes out of foreign aid. It's the same thing with USAID, right? And cutting, not that it was that much to begin with, but cutting food that we're sending to save people from starvation and disease in sub-Saharan Africa is going to somehow automatically wind up in your pocket. Most of the time, it's not. It's winding up in the pocket of the wealthiest Americans who are getting tax cuts under this administration. So I don't think that frustration with affordability at home means that we cut off aid abroad. I do think that what we spend money on abroad has to align with our values, which is why I think you see more and more people in my party saying, wait a minute, it's one thing to want to make sure that Israel can shoot down missiles that are being rained down on them by the Iranians. And it's another thing to be sponsoring Netanyahu going in to annex the West Bank or, going in to invade Gaza, right? Yeah. But I really think we have to talk about what we're doing with our money here at home in a way that is accountable to the domestic side of the policy ledger. Because that's not, I'm sorry, but the reason it's unaffordable here at home is not because we're helping certain causes abroad. That's never been the biggest share of our funding. And the trade-offs are real, but the trade-offs are between people who live here and other people who live here. And mainly it's the wealthiest people who live here versus everybody else.
So if the concern is anti-Semitism, I think that just to circle back, I have seen an insane explosion of anti-Semitic comments on Instagram in a way that I thought would be impossible even 5 years ago. And you have people who are actually neo-Nazis taking advantage of the post-October 7th discourse to sort of piggyback on that to push their own agenda, pretending they care about Palestinians.
It's a pretext. I mean, a lot of people use it as a pretext, right? And part of how you can tell that is a lot of us are so troubled by a whole generation, right, focused on what we are seeing and rightly disturbed by what we're seeing every day in Gaza. But remember, some of these things, some of these expressions of anti-Semitism happened on the morning of October 8th. Before Israel even responded to October 7th, there were some of these things happening, on U.S. soil, the triangles being painted that are like a Hamas symbol. So that's part of what I'm saying. These two things in principle are not connect. They don't relate, right? Anti-Semitism, by definition, is an unjustifiable racial hatred, right? A position on the conflict and the effect that it's having, especially the effect it's having on men, women, and children in Gaza, is concern for people, right? Those two things in principle should not have anything to do with each other.
Right.
But in practice, a lot of people who are worried about their kids or worried about their family or worried about themselves see that, it's not hypothetical. It's not just somebody getting yelled at on a college campus. It's people getting shot up and a guy with a flamethrower thinking he's helping children in Gaza by attacking Jews, right? This shit is real.
No, I think there's a lot of misguided energy when it comes to what people see as support. But I will say most of the Jewish people that I know that are my friends are pretty anti-Zionist, and they see, and I would agree with them, that every Israeli bomb dropped on Gaza, every bullet fired into an aid line just ratchets up the anti-Semitism a little bit more. And so you have to ask the question, was October 7th the driving force of anti-Semitic outbursts? It really feels like the Israeli government and the IDF's military action is the driving force of anti-Semitism.
I mean, I don't think it's okay to blame anti-Semitism on, like, it comes too close to making it sound like that makes the anti-Semitism okay. I know that's not what you're saying, but I think we hear that. At the same time, yeah, like everything that Netanyahu's government does right now, like everything you see the IDF doing in the food lines or the annexation or the ground movements into Gaza is incinerating a really important part of the moral fiber of what connects America to Israel and what I think connects a lot of American Jews to the Zionist project, right? The Zionist project is supposed to be about this moral realization that something happened, like a near extermination event for American Jews happened. And part of how the world needs to respond is to recognize that Jewish people will not be safe anywhere unless they have self-determination in their homeland.
The settler expansions into the West Bank have been pretty crazy.
And again, designed to make it impossible for there to be a functional Palestinian state. Netanyahu's government is doing everything that it can to make it impossible, right? I mean, that's what the annexation, the settlements, that's what this is about. It's about spiking the two-state solution, which also means defying what has generally been America's position, which is part of why a lot of people in America are saying during Netanyahu to defy forward. And I think what the establishment and those in power need to think about, and the whole country needs to think about, is, are we actually ready to do what it would take for a two-state solution to work? Is there any shred of hope? Or is two-state solution just something that politicians can say to kind of end this very difficult question and move on to the next question without being committed to what it actually takes to make it happen?
You think that it's possible?
I have to believe that it's possible, because I can't think of something that would be better. But I also want to be honest toward your question, like it's never felt more out of reach in my lifetime than it does right now.
We're looking at it like, how can anybody possibly, talk about October 7th at this particular point when things have escalated to this horrific point where, like I said, you have 60,000 plus dead, and most importantly, people can't leave. Well, first of all, they don't want to leave, but the lack of mobility, I think, is the scariest part. And so I think a lot of us wonder, whenever we're 40, 50 years old and we're in positions of political power, are we still going to be in this situation, or is there going to be this permanent political gridlock when it comes to Israel-Palestine?
I think a lot of that does come down to leadership, and American leadership can make a difference, but I think the leadership there is what will make the most difference. And I think that this gridlock is being kept in place largely by Netanyahu because it's his ticket to stay in power, right? I mean, you see the people taking to the streets in Israel. What he's doing is obviously not good for the hostages either. And they're still hostages, right? Which also falls out of the discourse sometimes. But like, that's real. They are real. There's a lot of people who all they want is the bodies back of their loved ones. But there's also people who are alive, right? None of that is getting better because of what Netanyahu is doing. He needs this to stay just as bad as it is so that he can stay in power and stay ahead of criminal charges and all the rest of it. So that has to change. And there needs to be American leadership that can do two things at once, that can be committed to the security of people in Israel and unwilling to sponsor some of the things that defy American policy and prevent peace from becoming real.
Right. Do you think that there's any way that Israel will get back the right or the left? Because they lost the left first, and it took about a year and a half for them to lose the right. Do you think that our relationship politically with them is going to be permanently severed, or is there a bridge back to mutual understanding for them?
What I know is that if it becomes just a partisan thing, then I think the relationship is destroyed, because it used to be a bipartisan concern. I mean, it still is a bipartisan concern, but feels very different now.
In terms of the anger that's been brewing on both sides over the past couple years?
Yeah, I mean, more and more people, I think, on both sides are pessimistic about a two-state solution. But I can't think of anything better.
Yeah. As far as overall American intervention, one of the big things that Trump ran on was not being an interventionist. And
they said, he will start a war. I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars. Only America first. America first.
It's kind of letting people handle their own problems. At least, maybe we have some covert funding of CIA programs, but we're not going to send any more troops explicitly to different countries.
Yeah, but we'll blow up a boat off the coast of Venezuela and rename the DOD to the Department of War. Like, it's kind of weird how he came in saying he's the peace guy, and then he's posting Apocalypse Now memes about making war on Chicago. Like, this guy's not exactly a peacenik, right?
There's been a war in Chicago for a long time. I don't think he knows about it. As far as your decision to volunteer to be deployed to Afghanistan, what prompted that decision for you?
Part of what prompted it was I grew up hearing these stories about how Americans came together in a previous generation to serve. but I saw kind of the opposite in my generation. Like if you look back at the generation like JFK or even like George H.W. Bush, right? These guys were in World War II together. They got to know each other. They became Republicans. They became Democrats. They were rich. They were working class. Like they all just kind of formed this sense of what it meant to be an American while they were defending America in World War II. It cut across class. And by the time the Iraq War was erupting, and I was a college student when that happened, very few people who I saw like on the campus of Harvard were going to wind up in uniform. I think the statistic is something like 50% of the graduating class of Princeton in the 40s went directly into the military.
Wow.
Something like that.
And that was to the Pacific or Europe or something like that. Yeah.
And, you know, a couple generations later, I could like count on one hand the people I knew in the Ivy Leagues who were going to ever wear the uniform.
And you feel like that was having a chilling effect on patriotism and camaraderie across the board?
Yeah, because it meant you were farming out our wars to lower income people. And this started, you know, I mean, this largely started in the post-Vietnam era. Because in Vietnam, everybody, but not quite everybody got drafted, right? Like Donald Trump famously avoided, he was a millionaire's son, he avoided having to go to war.
I also heard, my grandma told me this yesterday, she was alive during the Vietnam War, that if you were enrolled in a university, you didn't have to be drafted.
Right. So imagine imagine the resentment that comes out of that, right? And then you get to my generation, and it's like, this is a working class war. And then I'm against the Iraq War as a student. I'm watching this stuff play out. I'm looking at who's serving. And I'm beginning to ask, like, if I'm not serving, am I part of the problem? And so I signed up for the reserve, which is a way to kind of keep your day job and be in the military. 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, and then you might get deployed. The thing that really put me over the top, actually, was when I was knocking on doors for Barack Obama. I was in the low-income counties in Iowa, and I'm knocking on doors. It felt like every other house I knocked on the door of, there was this like working-class kid who mentioned to me that he was about to go to basic training or something. I'm like, well, if they're going, then I ought to be going. So I did. I signed up. I became part of the Navy Reserve. Loved the people that I served with. Knew that it sooner or later would mean getting deployed, and then it meant, in the end, getting deployed to Afghanistan while I was mayor. So that was a little complicated. I had to go on leave as being mayor to go be a lieutenant, but it was one of the most important experiences in my life.
Do you think foundationally 9/11 had an emotional impact on you?
Totally, yeah. I mean, you know, the way it felt watching the fighter jets go overhead that day, it happened on like registration day, my sophomore year.
Okay.
And there's people walking around outside trying to get a cell phone signal, trying to call their loved ones. It was, I think, the first time that my generation saw a chain of events that happened overseas impact us here at home directly. Usually it was the other way around. And we were trying to use our imagination to think, oh, like, okay, how is something that's happening, some policy decision here in America going down in Africa? But here's like, this chain of events started in a cave in Afghanistan with Osama bin Laden, and it ended with thousands of Americans getting killed.
So it broke this invisible wall that had existed.
We kind of lost our innocence in a way. And then we lost our innocence again, because after 9/11, there's this amazing moment where everybody comes together, American flags, left, right, and center, everybody kind of feels a certain way. We're going to help each other, we're going to like stand up. But then that goodwill gets squandered in the Bush years by invading Iraq, which has nothing to do with 9/11, and a whole bunch of other things that happened.
Yeah, I think part of why so many people were on board with the invasion of Iraq is, for one, people didn't know the geographic differences between the countries.
Yeah, it's all like the Middle. Afghanistan isn't even strictly speaking the Middle East, but to a lot of people, it's like kind of the same general Middle Eastern vibe.
Right. Get them. Right. It's also the word terror became used so commonplace as a justification for so many things.
They want to drag the modern world back to the past, to a dark age of violence, fanaticism, and terror.
Terrorism.
Terrorists.
Radical Islamic
terrorists. The terror network will have nuclear weapons.
And the problem with the word terror is that it kind of evokes imagery of like someone throwing a stink bomb in the bathroom, or like, you know, doing ding dong ditch. It's just terror for terror's sake, just adrenaline seeking activities with no possible root cause that compelled them into violent action. And I'm not saying that you should ever advocate or condone terrorism, but when someone does something crazy, there's typically somewhere down there a valid grievance that was taken to the extreme degree.
Yeah, but that's the difference between understanding something and justifying it, or explaining something versus explaining something away.
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. A man can be jailed in Afghanistan if his beard is not long enough.
It was a public relations campaign on behalf of the government to make sure we didn't know why Al-Qaeda was actually upset with us.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that Nobody's really in the mood to put things in context in 2001. But also, I think there's a correct awareness that, like, whatever missteps the U.S. made in foreign policy, that doesn't mean it's okay to hijack aircraft and fly them into buildings in New York City and murder everybody. I'm not saying you're saying that.
We made someone so mad that they were willing to do that.
I would say a lot of things made them so mad that they were willing to do that. But yeah, U.S. policy played a role. No question.
And it's important because if you don't want to repeat those mistakes and be back in the same situation, you're likely to do something like perhaps invade Iraq, which will create the same kind of resentment that led to 9/11.
But here's what I'm worried about from a Gen Z perspective, where I see a lot of folks in Gen Z who are open to like an isolationist approach. So like, none of this worked. All we do anytime we go abroad is we fuck something up, so let's just stay put, right? And I think Trump speaks to that, actually. By the way, that's all bullshit. Like, he was for the Iraq War, and then later on pretended to be against it. And like I said, now he's doing these warlike things. But never mind. I get that feeling. I think it's really important not to give into it, because the world is going to develop along some pattern and some set of values. And a lot's going to depend on who's leading and who is projecting. I'm not saying we project force everywhere. I think we only project enough force to defend ourselves. But what else are we projecting in terms of leadership? Because if not, somebody else is. And I do not want the kind of world order, if you want to call it that, of the 21st century to unfold on Putin's terms. I don't want it to unfold on Xi Jinping's terms. I want it to unfold on terms that are a little more consistent with what I think of as, yes, American values, but also universal values, like things you don't have to be American to believe in, around freedom and self-determination. It doesn't mean every country is going to be a liberal democracy that looks like America. Right. Well, especially America now. I'm not sure I'd wish the current conditions in America on a lot of other countries. But I just don't think we can retreat and expect that to go well. I think another lesson of 9/11 is whatever's going on in the world will come find us one way or the other.
Did you see anything in Afghanistan where you felt like it was objectively wrong and needed to be corrected in terms of societal behavior and cultural practices?
You mean among the Afghans, or you mean... Sure, but that doesn't mean I thought it was my place to go in and like fix it.
Yeah.
Like there are...
You just mentioned a universal sort of moral code, and that kind of was, I was thinking of certain practices in certain societies that are seen as objectively non-democratic, oppressive, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there was an enormous amount of corruption. Like it was sort of like ingrained in the culture in a way. But you have to understand that that's kind of what it took to get things done. Doesn't mean no corruption was okay, but it's why I think an American would be shocked at some of these things that, like, police commanders would just be paid in cash, but also they personally would be expected out of their personal pockets to pay the salaries of all the people who reported to them, because like none of the government machinery was working to do that.
Like a Departed style Ponzi scheme.
Kind of, yeah. That really takes me back. Yeah, I forgot that.
Didn't want to get you off track here.
That's the one with everybody getting shot in the face, basically, right?
Yeah, at the end. I don't want to spoil it, but there's that scene in the apartment building and everyone basically dies. So we're talking about Afghanistan.
Yeah, sorry.
Sort of societal clash.
Suddenly I'm thinking about elevators.
Anti-isolationist and in terms of...
Yeah, so like, take the treatment of women. Objectively bad, obviously. Extremely objectively bad in Afghanistan. Now, like, they don't think women should go to school. They're not going to let women have jobs. Like, just bad.
So what do they do?
What do the women do? I mean, they're expected to be at home to produce and raise children.
Just like domestic servitude.
Pretty much, right? Does that mean we invade them and make them change that? No. It does mean that, like, leadership, American leadership, Western leadership matters, right? It matters especially as the economic leader, to the extent we can stay the economic leader. Like, we nudge things in the right direction and say, like, if you want to work with us, there's some things that we care about in terms of human rights in your country, right? So that's just one example, but that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but the strategic objective of the Afghan war, the Afghanistan conflict, was to disempower the Taliban?
Yeah, although by the time I was there, it was getting a little harder to figure out what the strategic objective actually was. Like, I would go work out, and there's this room on the ISAF headquarters where I was stationed. It was like a gym workout room. And they had this thing on the wall, this poster that was like a PowerPoint of the like mission. And it was so convoluted, like there were so many things on there. It was meant, I think, for morale. It was meant to remind us why we were there. But the more I looked at it, the less I understood exactly why we were there. I think that's part of what made it very hard to get out. Because if you don't know exactly what your objectives are going in, especially once you've overthrown the Taliban, which happens super quickly, then it's really hard to figure out what the terms are going to be for you to get out.
So you felt like it went on for far too long?
Yeah, I mean, when I was there, that would have been year 13, 14. I was there in 2014, started in 2001. And by the way, we thought we were the ones turning out the lights. Like, I thought I was one of the last people there. And then it went on for years after that.
Would you describe your deployment as, was it calm or were you seeing combat?
I mean, I wasn't like breaking down doors, but it felt like combat when they were shooting rockets at us, for sure.
On the
It was
base.
not, usually on the base. And my job was to go outside the wire a lot, just like driving. We call it military Uber. Because the rule was you had to have 2 people qualified on a long gun, and not everybody there had a long gun. So some people just had pistols, some people had both. I was one of the ones who had both. So that meant, like, for my commander to go anywhere, the rule was I had to go with him, or somebody had to go with him. So it meant that I wound up just driving around Afghanistan a lot and seeing through my windshield what was going on in these cities.
What was going on?
It was just a city. I mean, there's this thing that happens when we hear about or see a place going through a war that you imagine that all anybody's doing there is war. Right. But there's like girls going to school and guys with watermelons on their shoulders coming back from the market and like hardware stores and a froyo place and like there's just life, right? It's a city.
Yeah.
It's a city that's going through a lot. It's a city where like every few days there's a bomb. But it's a city.
That's one thing I noticed about Ukraine. I went there about 30 days after the war began, and I was driving through the interior of the country where there were rockets being fired. And there was a concentrated effort to maintain normalcy and just do your day-to-day routine. People were going to coffee shops. Of course, the air raid sirens would make people go into bomb shelters for like 5 minutes, but it was almost like the bars were closing at 8 instead of midnight. It was just stuff like that where people don't want to lose their minds, and they want to keep morale high and not give in to the trauma and stress of the situation. Was it a similar thing in Afghanistan?
Yeah, because people have jobs to do. Like, unless you're literally in the military, like, just because there's a war in your country doesn't mean war is your job. Like, you have some job in a coffee shop or whatever it is. And the biggest thing I took away, I think, was the sense of how people go about their everyday life when all of that is going on and happening to them.
What was your opinion about the withdrawal?
It was brutal. I mean, it was really, really hard to watch. It was hard to watch. Well, it was hard to watch the bombing because it was the bombing where American service members were killed, because that was right in a location that I drove through or at a lot of times and worried. I knew it was a high-risk spot, and I was worried that would be one of the places we would get hit. It was brutal to watch those images and the airplanes taking off and people clinging to them. And it's also brutal what's happened since. Like the way that a lot of people have been left behind who put their lives on the line.
So there was no real exit plan for people or allies in the Afghan National Army?
I mean, clearly it was not executed in a way that took care of them. And then the decision by the Trump administration to just scrap all of these programs. There's a lot of people who are just high and dry.
What do you think about what's going on with the border right now? Or I guess with ICE occupying cities and federal agents being sent to places like Chicago and DC?
It's not okay to militarize an American city. And two things can be true. It can be true that we have immigration laws for a reason, and they should be upheld. And also, this doesn't justify militarizing an American city. Look, the border needs to be secure. Right? That's been an issue for a long time. It's also true that the system, the thing you're supposed to say to sound like you're right on this issue is you're supposed to say, I'm for more legal and less illegal immigration, which is true. I mean, I'm for that too. But if you go around saying that, you have to look at what we've actually done as a country. And one of the things we've done as a country is not made it possible for enough people to come in legally while having these economic pulls that pretty much our economy requires a certain number of people. We're set up in a way that relies on a certain number of people to come in illegally. And we expect that to just work. And of course, it doesn't. And there have been attempts to reform it. There was a big one in 2005 or 2006. There was a bill, a year or two ago that wasn't a complete reform, but it would have helped. The last time we had actual comprehensive immigration reform in this country was 1986.
Yeah, under Reagan, of all people.
Yeah, and I knew the congressman he was from Louisville, who was one of the people who did it. He was a big Notre Dame guy. And under Reagan in 84, 86, they did that. It was Ron Mazzoli, this Democratic congressman from Louisville. Al Simpson is this very conservative senator from Wyoming. They got together and they made a plan, they did it. And we haven't done a comprehensive reform since that day.
For me, I could be wrong about this, but I see a pretty clear solution to the immigration issue, which is to dramatically increase the number of asylum judges and put a lot more funding into the immigration courts. Because right now, I've had some experiences at the border. I keep in touch with some migrants that I've met in the Arizona desert and over the river in Texas. And most of them, their asylum hearing, their first preliminary hearing where they go to meet an immigration judge to figure out if they can stay or be deported, is 4.5 years. And so, especially now with Trump in office, it's like, okay, you're sending ICE to these cities. What message does that send to somebody who's already here illegally and thinks, should I go to my asylum hearing in 3 years? I think I'm going to avoid doing that because I'm here already and I'm one of 380 million people, so I'm probably just going to kind of bleed into society and not make myself an object of deportation.
But that doesn't speak to the economic issue, which is a whole American economy almost designed to need more labor than we're able to supply.
And one thing that I want to say too is that there's a notion that Americans wouldn't ever want to do farm labor. They say only immigrants would want to do these jobs. No, only immigrants would do those jobs for that amount of money. Yeah. I'm sure that if it was affordable, there would be tons of Americans, especially in the inner cities, who are like, I can move to the Central Valley of California and make $20 an hour picking artichokes, or I don't know how you actually extract artichokes from the ground, but doing whatever you have to do to get artichokes onto plates from the farm. People would do it. Yeah. It's the fact that they're being paid almost nothing.
Yeah. No, I mean, the whole thing about Americans is a willingness to do hard work for good money. Yeah. Right? I think you're right. If the good money isn't there, that's when things start to change.
Mm-hmm. So would you ever run for president again?
I don't know. I mean, I did once, so obviously, it's crossed my mind. But it's not like I'm somebody whose life will never be complete unless I run for president again. What I'm trying to figure out is, how do I make myself useful? And there's a lot of ways to do that. But what I'm doing right now is making the case for the values and the ideas, and in some cases, leaders that I believe in. I'm going to do a lot of that going in the midterms, and writing about what I see happening in the world and speaking out about it, because I know that that's worth doing no matter what.
Who's on your current Mount Rushmore of leaders that you think on the progressive side of the aisle you think could lead us to victory?
Mount Rushmore?
Yeah. Controversial thing. Let's not think about the history of it right now.
I mean,
We're
like,
using it as a figurative symbol.
Like historically?
Right now.
I think,
not dead or alive. We're talking right now. Mount Rushmore.
That's kind of twisted to put anybody who's alive on Mount Rushmore, but
it's a thought experiment.
Okay.
We're not building anything.
I mean, I don't know about Mount Rushmore, but I can tell you people I like to call and see how they're thinking about things.
Yeah, that's kind of
and you know, a lot of it is people who are my generation who are thinking about things a little bit differently. Senators in my generation, people like Andy Kim, who's new in the Senate from New Jersey, or Alyssa Slatkin, who's my senator right now in Michigan, who I think just have a different. They're not like captive to the we're doing it this way because we've always done it this way kind of mentality. I'll put John Ossoff in that bucket too in Georgia. I think there are a lot of people who people probably haven't heard of as much because they're considered more junior in the House, but are really just thinking with a level of firepower and originality. Some of them are more moderate, some of them are more left, but from Jake Auchincloss in Massachusetts to Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez in the West to Sarah McBride in Delaware, they're thinking at a level that I think has the kind of imagination that we need. And then a lot of the best progressive leaders, I think, are mayors who get very little national attention, except when something goes wrong in their city, but are doing remarkable work. Like Mike Johnson in Denver has come as close as any big city mayor has ever come to just figuring out housing. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution,
and
but
decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms.
Okay, I didn't know that, but good to know.
Brandon Scott from Baltimore is doing great too.
Yeah, I worked with him a lot, especially when the bridge collapsed a couple of years ago. And yeah, they've driven violent crime down in Baltimore. They're doing a lot to get the city to a new and better place.
What have they done to create that great result?
Well, each city is different and each story is different because it has to be very place-based. But a few things that we know work. I mean, one, again, is to have compassion, not let compassion take you all the way through to just anything goes. It's things like housing first, which is the idea that sometimes it doesn't work to say we're not going to get you shelter until you're clean, because the reason you're not clean has something to do with you not having shelter, breaking the cycle. It has to do with finding a way to build up the legitimacy of law enforcement, recognizing the problems that have come historically at the hands of law enforcement through the generations, and also recognizing that if we do not make it possible for police to successfully do their job, we are not safe, and we have to support that work, and also not expect them to be the mental health provider of first resort, right? That's another thing that I think Donnie's talked about here that's really important, is the relevance of making sure you send in somebody who's qualified to help on mental health when there is a crisis. I think they've done a lot of work on the economic front to recognize, okay, some things are federal policy, but local leadership has a responsibility to make sure this place is livable. That's where clearing out some of the barriers to getting housing built. It takes local leadership to do that. I think it's really interesting to see what Daniel Lurie is doing in San Francisco, because he came in at a time when people were really pessimistic about the city, and it has kind of a back to basics approach. So again, I'm not mapping these leaders aren't all good because they're more left or because they're more center. They're good because they're crafting solutions that make sense where they actually live.
I think what Baltimore did too, they have this group called Safe Street that Brandon Scott has, and it's a community intervention team. Mostly they look like local football coaches. They're dads in their 40s and 50s who are all super buff, but they're also trained in de-escalation and some basic PTSD therapy tenets. And they'll go in and they'll intervene and talk to at-risk youth who end up perpetuating inner-city violence. And most of them just need somebody to talk to. They're not these broken people who will never be fixed. It's possible to help somebody with kindness. You don't have to incarcerate them, teach them a lesson every time to do something wrong.
Especially when you're dealing with teenagers whose brains are still developing. I think about this a lot more because I have kids, and I'm watching the neurons firing in our 4-year-old kids. That process is continuing well into your 20s.
Yeah.
And being attuned to that is a really important part of how you do right by people and keep everyone safe.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a teenager, I was insanely stupid.
We all?
I mean, we had this game when we were 16 where we would all run into the grocery store and we would grab as much beer as we possibly could, and we would race to the exit, and whoever got there first with as much beer as possible would win. And
Did you win?
I never won because I'm kind of slow, but I'm not going to say his name because he has a good job now. But he would win, and the point is he has a good job.
No,
he wouldn't be able to have a good job if he was put in prison for a long time, or jail, or juvie or something.
Yeah.
Not saying you should be able to do that, but just goes to show the teenage boy mind is not exactly a diamond.
Yeah, but we grow up.
You chisel away at the diamond.
Is that how that works? I don't know a lot about diamond cutting.
I don't know. I just know it's a dark business. But anyways, you talked about the bridge collapse in Baltimore. I think now would be a good time to reflect on your time as transportation secretary. If you were to look back at that long period of time, what's the achievement that you're most proud of?
Can I do 3?
Yeah.
All right. So the one that doesn't get a lot of coverage is the safety work. So like I said when we started our conversation, tens of thousands of people die every year in this country in crashes. We reduced that. We didn't end that, but we helped reduce it. And we had about 4 billion people get on an airplane on my watch, and 0 crash fatalities in commercial airline crashes. So there's a safety one. 2, the infrastructure bill. And we got 20,000 projects done and about 70,000 projects started. And that, some of that's still playing out. Some of it'll take decades, and some of it's already done. And they said you couldn't pass this big infrastructure. Trump tried, and he couldn't get it done. We got it done, and I'm really proud of the projects that we did. Everywhere, literally everywhere. I drive past some of them now, just when I go take the kids to school every day in Michigan. And then the 3rd is the airline work, which they're trying to dismantle right now. But when we came in, it was so incredibly frustrating the way airlines would treat passengers. And we stepped in and did something about that. We enforced the rules that were already there. We had record enforcement actions against airlines that were leaving people stranded with no help.
Who was the worst airline when you came in?
I'm not going to pick like a single worst airline because each one had its problems. I think the worst single acute moment was the Southwest meltdown. Right? And we made sure there was accountability for that, like more than $100 million. But it wasn't all just like fines going back to us. It was money going back to passengers, which is the most important part. We put in rules and tools, things like flightrights.gov, which is a website you can use to see how the different airlines are going to treat you. Make sure that you can get your money back if you get stuck and you need a hotel or you need a meal. And we even started a process, which Trump just killed, to get compensation for your time if it's the airline's fault and you have this extreme, like many hour-long delay. And the result is airlines started treating passengers better. And partly because we made them, partly because they knew we were watching. And by the way, the airline business was going just fine by the time we left. So they were still profitable and they were taking better care of passengers. And one thing I'm really pissed about right now is that Trump's Department of Transportation is dismantling that. They got rid of the rule that we were developing that would get you that compensation. They are getting rid of another rule that says that the airlines have to tell you what the fees are. Not even like regulating the fees, just saying they got to tell you what the extra fees are
in terms of like
before you buy.
Spirit Airlines will say it's $25, but then you know to get a bag it's $35 and 2 bags is like $10 million.
The airfare is $29, but like if you want a seat it's $30, and if you want to like sit in that seat somehow it's an extra 10. That kind of
One
stuff.
time I was on a Spirit flight and I said, hey, can I have some water? And they said, yeah, it's going to be like, $2.50. I said, I don't have any money, I'm sorry. And they gave me a cup of ice and they said, wait 46 minutes. And they knew the exact time where ice would become water.
Meaning they do that every day.
Yeah, and they weren't making a joke. They were being serious about it. Like, this is a way for you to get a discount. And it really made me think.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that we stepped in to do something about. But now they're going the other way. And it's part of what they're doing more broadly. On banks, they're letting credit fees that there was a rule that you could do that, now you can do it. With these companies you have to go to file your taxes, this administration killed the direct file that would allow you to just do it yourself and not have to go through one of these companies. And on the airline side, they're starting to dismantle I'm not super surprised. Like my replacement at the Department of Transportation was literally an airline lobbyist.
Inside baseball.
But that's what they're doing. But anyway, if you ask me about the things I'm proudest of, because some of those things are in law, so they'd be harder to take apart. So it's the safety work, it's the infrastructure projects we did in every part of the country, and it's what we did to make it better to be an airline passenger.
And on the inverse, what are some things that you wish you had done differently, or if you were to do it again, that you would change course?
I mean, there was a derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, where we had folks on the ground very quickly, but we did not understand that people were getting bad information and confusing information that left them like even more terrorized than they were by the chemical spill that had happened because of the derailment. And so even though there were no fatalities, it was just an incredibly serious incident that if I had understood the information issues sooner and gotten there, then I think I could have helped that community better deal with that. So that's an example of something that we learned the hard way.
When you say bad information, what was that information?
So there's a bunch of online stuff being pushed, making people question what they were being told by health authorities on what was and wasn't something to worry about, when you should hold off on drinking the water, when it was okay.
About the toxicity of
that
material.
Kind of stuff. Exactly. Because there's a cloud of black smoke over them. They're saying, okay, is the air safe? Is the water safe? Is the soil safe? And it was hard enough for the government to get them good information. And then you had this flood of bad information coming in online. And it turned out it was coming from all over the place, far left, far right, and other countries.
Yeah, I remember. That was a conspiracy charge time period.
Yeah. I mean, it's just one of many, as we know. And more generally, I'd say it took us a while to understand the effect of some of these conspiracy things. So because that happened in Ohio, we were more attuned to what was going on when hurricanes Helene and Milton hit. But there were a lot of things when those hurricanes hit, especially the North Carolina side, where people weren't applying for money that they should and could get because they had been told that it wasn't going to happen, or they were being told that, like, money wouldn't go to you if you had a Trump sign in your house or stuff like that.
That's like
totally
just Facebook misinfo.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was everywhere. But by then we knew a little bit more about how to intervene and do something about it. Another thing that we cared about this, but I would be even more focused on it if I was doing it over again, was the red tape that makes it hard to build anything in this country. So projects are incredibly expensive. Like in New York, we're trying to do the 2nd Avenue subway. Billions of dollars, and the tunnel's already there. It's been there for years, just getting all the other stuff done. And I can point to a lot of smaller projects that have hit these same issues. And it turns out the federal government is not set up to make sure projects go quickly. It's set up to make sure they don't go wrong. And it's important to make sure they don't go wrong. But we've turned the dial so far in terms of making sure nothing goes wrong, because that might embarrass a politician, that we've had a hard time making it possible to actually get the thing done.
So there's so much administrative bureaucracy and so much red tape that you can't get something basic done without a 4 to 6 month paperwork process.
Or years, which is making it harder. And this isn't just transportation. It's affecting how we build housing. It's affecting how we build clean energy infrastructure, which is super important if we want to at least like bend the curve on climate change and have it be less bad. So really important things are at stake in getting rid of some of that bureaucratic red tape that just gets in the way again and again.
And you wish that you had taken more steps to dismantle that jumbled?
Yeah, I mean, I pushed on it, but I know now more things that I wish I knew. Like there are things I figured out by year 4 that if I knew them in year 1, I think we could have gotten more traction.
So those are the main 2 things?
Yeah, those are the first ones that come to mind. There's a whole bunch of other things, an interview I would have done a little differently, or a project that I have certain thoughts about or whatever, but those are the things. And then I guess the third thing I would say is, we did improve the number of people who are dying in car crashes in this country, like thousands less per year, but it's still like tens of thousands. So we didn't get the job done.
Well, there's also certain states that have laws that make it more difficult.
No question.
Like
that's part of what we were dealing
specifically
with.
Louisiana. They have drive-through daiquiri locations.
True.
You know, I'm just saying there's places, there's certain cultural things that if you want to, I don't know if drunk driving is the leading cause of death behind the wheel.
It's not the only thing to worry about. It's up there. But, you know, a big one now is distracted driving, where people, totally. And I think phone companies and tech companies need to recognize that they have more responsibility to have features that make it harder to, we have this whole idea called foreseeable misuse. Like basically, even if the instruction manual says don't do this, if you know that everybody's going to do this, then you have to do something to make it harder. Same thing with the so-called self-driving cars that weren't really self-driving. Like the manual says like you have to have your eye on the road at all times, but everybody knows that people are just sitting back. And there are a bunch of problems with some of these cars.
Yeah, also the internal display, like the CarPlay setup is very distracting to older drivers. Like my grandfather just got a new Mercedes and it has this like big CarPlay screen inside, and it might as well be like an iPad in the car.
Interesting.
He's like, look at this, you know, and he's really doing that.
No, and you are seeing some things like, you know, I went 4 years without getting an Uber because there was either I was driving the van to get kids to school or there was a security detail taking me somewhere. So now like I'm using Uber and Lyft again and the subway again. And now I've noticed some of those apps have like a senior mode that just makes it less complicated.
That's awesome.
I'm 43, but I think I'm going to start using the senior mode because I just don't want all these like distractions. But you know, there are some technical things you can do that would help.
Layout-wise, do you think there should be more cities like Dallas and Phoenix or more cities like New York City, St. Augustine, Florida, South Philadelphia?
In terms of like the urban design?
In terms of walkability and not infinite suburban sprawl of bland corporate storefronts.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an urbanist. Like I love a city that is walkable, that has a lot of mixed use, that has a lot of vibrancy. I would say it's also possible to do that in more spread out or smaller cities. Like we did that in South Bend, Indiana. Not, you know, it doesn't look like Manhattan, but we found that was a place where you could do mixed use, by which I mean like stores downstairs, apartments upstairs, or something like that. It's not just a building for a store and a building to live in and so on. I mean, people didn't like it at first. Like we did things like bike lanes and just more sidewalks, and people were like, no one's ever gonna use the bike lane, but like it mattered and it helped. But one thing I think is interesting about Phoenix is, you know, I worked there in 2004. It was my first job out of college working on a campaign there. And there was like nothing you could do as a pedestrian in the middle of, I thought I was reading the map wrong because I was supposed to report for work this location that was like literally in the dead center of the city. And I got there and I was like, this isn't the middle of a city with 1 million+ people in it. Like this is a parking lot. Now, if you go there, like there is transit, which is like, that was a lift, like culturally, to get people in the Phoenix region to get into transit. There are places you can walk to. So again, it's not Manhattan, but they're showing that it can be done in a place like that. And I believe in that style, that pattern of development. But you got to plan for that. You got to fund the kind of transportation and transit that makes it possible to do that. You got to have a culture around that too. That's the other thing I think is really important is the culture. There's this idea in a lot of places that like, if you're on the bus, that means you have no choice but to take the bus. And we should establish like good bus options. So also like maybe you have a car at home, but like you don't feel like bringing 2,000 pounds of metal with you everywhere you go. So you take the bus.
Riding the bus is awesome. You can go on your phone. You can sometimes meet people, not always, but you see interesting things. You feel like you're a part of your environment. You know, the car is like a really isolating sort of cube where you have your music and you have your familiar items, and it's a lonely, robotic experience that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I'm just kidding. I like driving.
It can be.
I don't mind driving that much. It just sounded cool for me to end really dramatically. So my final question to you is an Indiana question. What can we do about Gary? How can we help Gary? I went to Gary recently.
So Gary, Indiana, for folks who aren't following, this is like you're talking about the just conditions in the city. They're kind of an extreme version of what I was talking about us living through in South Bend, where they were this industrial center and then they weren't, and they lost like the majority of their population. I think the answer has to do with a better set of connections into Chicagoland without becoming as expensive as Chicago is. And I think again, a lot of it all comes back to transportation, like making sure it's easier to come and go. Because you can get more quickly, if you're in Gary, you can get to downtown Chicago more readily if you have a car than getting from places on the north and west side of Chicago in the city limits of Chicago to the Loop. So there's a lot of like promise and potential there. But you've got to make sure that there's the right kind of connections, that people have access to those kinds of jobs, that you don't have to have a car to get those jobs. And there's just a lot of environmental work that has to be done because of the legacy of the heaviest days of some of the industries that polluted there to make sure it's a place people want to live. But I actually think that Northwest Indiana, I mean, if you're thinking about Chicagoland, it's got nowhere to grow but in that direction. And I think Northwest Indiana is one of the most underrated or undervalued coasts in America.
It's beautiful. Oh, my actual last question is, do you have an ancestral connection to the island of Malta?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, my dad immigrated from there. Actually, the original connection is Gozo, which is the island next to Malta, which is even smaller. I was there recently. We took the family there. I wanted my kids to meet their relatives. I went to this little village, and there was a guy from there, Anton Buttigieg, same last name. He was the president of Malta, not even related. And like a bunch of people have the same last name there. So it's like the land of the Buttigiegs.
My mom's there right now, and she called me yesterday. She's like, you're interviewing Mayor Pete tomorrow, right? I was like, yeah. She's like, I just saw Buttigieg's bridge, and I'm in Malta.
Yeah.
And so she said, ask him if he's ancestrally Maltese.
Yeah, it's this incredible country. It's this like tiny, like very unusual country. It's independent, English speaking, but also Maltese speaking, which is a Semitic language. Been through everything from like the Crusades to World War II. It's this like very strategic spot. Like I go on all day about Malta, but it's, I even like to claim that our people invented the building. Because some of the oldest freestanding structures in the world are these megalithic temples, like older than Stonehenge, much more interesting than Stonehenge. And they built those, and they hadn't even invented the wheel yet.
Yeah.
Like they didn't even have algebra, and they're making these incredible structures.
It's amazing. You know, my people, the Irish, actually invented spacing. Seriously. Yeah, there was no spaces between letters if you look at old tablets until the Irish poets of the 5th century.
Well done.
Do you believe in a united and free Ireland?
I mean, I believe in peace in Northern Ireland, which is a good example to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier of how something that seemed like generationally intractable changed in our lifetime. Yeah, I'm not an Ireland expert, but
I just got back from there.
Right. And you're in Belfast, too. You're in Northern
I was in
Ireland, right?
Belfast, and there's some tension there still.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
West Belfast, they've got murals of IRA soldiers with ski masks and guns.
You know, I went to Dublin one time and wound up talking with this guy in a bar who was incarcerated with Bobby Sands, who was one of the leaders who died in a hunger strike resisting in Ireland. And he talked about how Bobby Sands was so committed to building a sense of Irish heritage that he would make crosswords in Gaelic, in Irish Gaelic, on toilet paper and like secretly pass them around so that his fellow inmates could learn Irish and like understand like their heritage. Like, yeah, some of the stories are incredible.
Yeah, my piece is about the Irish language revival.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you know all about them.
There's 56,000 native Irish speakers, but it's increasing because they're putting more and more kids in full immersion, what they call Gael schools, where they speak Irish from kindergarten to 8th grade. Yeah. And so they're trying to get a resurgence, particularly in the South. But anyways, I know you got to get out of here. Thanks so much for your time.
Enjoy it.
I really appreciate it. I hope you had a great interview. Not sure what you guys have planned today, but I hope everything goes well. And I hope you like this background. This is a pretty nice view.
Yeah, it is.
I was hoping we could see the Freedom Tower, but it's being blocked by this damn urgent care building.
Channel 5 Live worldwide, Hollywood and blind. Fuck the authority, Channel 5 News. Channel 55. We don't fuck with custers. And 5 is the best number.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going?
Okay, good seeing you.
I know, long time no see.
Yeah, definitely lots happened since I saw you last.
AI is on my mind. Preschool's on my mind. Jess and I have 4-year-olds.
Are you still out west?
Yeah, I'm still out west. I'm at a motel in Arizona called Apache Junction Motel. It's pretty nice for $75 a night.
All right.
So we did our interview in New York City about 3 weeks ago. Less than, I think, 48 hours later, Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Utah. Off the bat, what was your initial reaction to that?
It's horrible. I mean, first of all, it is horrible for the reason that all political violence is horrible. It's a murder of a human being. And then the question was, what's going to happen next? Is this going to be a chance to unify people left, right, and center against violence? Which we saw a lot of leadership moving in that direction from, people like the governor of Utah to people like Bernie Sanders, kind of speaking roughly in the same language. Or was it going to become the occasion or the excuse for something else, which is what we saw out of the White House? I mean, both of those things have been playing out in the time since that happened. Very clearly, this is something that makes everybody less safe. And trying to respond to it in partisan terms misses the fact that all of us lose when there's political violence. It also obviously misses the reality, which is that, the bulk of political violence in the last decade in this country has not come from far left sources. I mean, this ending with the assassination of Charlie Kirk began with the assassination of a Democratic lawmaker and her husband in Minnesota. And these things are unfortunately accelerating or clustering. So it's beyond kind of parsing what went on in the mind of one disturbed individual. Like a disturbed person can be inspired or motivated by any number of things. And this person seems like a jumble of video game influence, political influence. We don't really know. But the point is, even when we do know more, the lesson will be the same, which is that we have got to be a country where political violence is not frequent, not normal, not accepted, not legitimized, not excused, not celebrated, and also not exploited.
As far as exploited, do you mean like, I guess, the conservative side of the aisle taking advantage of the situation to crack down on progressive groups by associating their cause with violence?
Not just progressive, but we have a general sense of it. And the vital thing to do when you see that sort of thing is to stand up to it. And I think for the left, there's a bit of a false choice being presented, that either we make good on our promise to do the right thing, lower the temperature, and do our part to reduce anything that could inspire violence, or we stand up to these attacks on our freedoms. We travel together. We reject political violence for the same reason that we reject any attempt to repress free speech, which is that both of those are an assault on freedom.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes with the broader trend of the thing that's been happening as far as, there was the lawsuit leveraged against Paramount, against CBS, the recent, I think what's a $15 billion lawsuit against the New York Times for some kind of defamation damages record that was hit. And so I think that it's been capitalized in that regard. But the precedent set is pretty dangerous because obviously when it comes to people who, I guess, I don't want to say abuse, but use the civil court system to their advantage by using high-paid attorneys and trying to bleed people's pockets that way, how does an average person, a Democrat, a citizen, an independent reporter actually stand up to what's happening?
Yeah, it's hard because even a lawsuit that gets laughed out of the courtroom, which looks like what's happening with the New York Times lawsuit, it's still expensive to deal with. And not everybody has the reserves of the New York Times to mount a defense. And so that chilling effect goes way beyond the New York Times or the Jimmy Kimmels to just ordinary people who wonder if they're going to be targeted, if they're going to be silenced. But I think the other really important thing to recognize is that most Americans are not on board with this. I'm really worried that the president has created this smokescreen or this sense that most people think that it's okay for the government to be intimidating people who criticize the government. And it's not. And that's something that should be unifying people across left, right, and center. I mean, these kinds of things are something that, I remember being younger, arguing with conservative and libertarian friends, over beers in college. And this was the kind of thing they were saying could happen. Now it's happening. So we should be on the same side about this, even if we're not on the same side about a lot of policy issues.
Do you think that Trump camp's willingness to just crack down on their adversaries in the media and in politics, they see as a justified backlash from the way that, I guess, big tech and Democrat-aligned companies silenced their free speech during the 2020 election era with COVID misinformation protocols and also like the Stop the Steal movement being suppressed on Facebook and elsewhere?
There is no comparison. And I think this is really important to understand. Look, we can argue about about whether Facebook or any social media platform did the right thing is they were trying to make sure they weren't part of the problem on COVID, but also trying to foster free speech. I mean, we can have that argument. But what we're talking about here is the government threatening, in some cases, appearing to threaten the broadcast rights of organizations that are politically criticizing the president. And so they may come up with these justifications for themselves, but I think it's really important to make clear that that's a false equivalence, that there is no comparison, not just from Democrats in early 2020s, but really at any point in modern American history, other than maybe a little bit the Nixon administration. But even then, there's no comparison between what they're doing right now and anything else that has happened.
I guess I just mean psychologically, there's so much vengeance that's accompanying Trump's second term, and I feel like part of that has to do with that equivalency being drawn between 2020 and this current moment. They feel like it's their time to get even.
It's possible. I mean, I don't want to, overstate my ability to get into their mentality. What I know is that this isn't right, and it's not going to make us any better off. The presidency is not for getting revenge. The presidency is for making our lives better. And I think another big part of what's happening right now is that public opinion is swinging pretty swiftly and strongly away from the president because of the basics, things like what we talked about when we sat down a while ago about the cost of living and about being able to get a job and just a lot of fundamental things in the country that have not gotten better. And I think the White House doesn't want to be talking about that, and they definitely don't want to be challenged on that. So they're going down this road, and yeah, they're using recent events as an excuse to do it. But again, if you look at the way the president talks about his desire to take comedians off the air, he was expressing that, including specifically about Jimmy Kimmel, long before what happened to Charlie Kirk.
Yeah. Going back to something you mentioned, has there been a very clear-cut motive established for the Hortman family murders?
What we know is that this guy had a lot of nationalist motivation, and he went around with a kill list that, as I understand it, was all Democrats and liberals. And he was looking for Democrats to kill. He found some, killed Melissa Hortman and her husband, shot other electeds. And this is another example of something.
I want to say rest in peace to the dog that was also killed.
And the dog, yeah. I mean, this horrific thing happened, and it was like a blip in right-wing media. Actually, more than that, worse than that, right? Here you have a guy who was like clearly, I mean, I don't know all of the things that were in his twisted psychology, but clearly motivated by some kind of warped vision of right-wing ideology going around killing Democrats. And then because he was on some volunteer veteran committee with dozens of people that was appointed by the governor, if you're only consuming right-wing media, you would believe that he was like a card-carrying Democrat, even though like that could not have been further from the truth. So it's one more example of how we're in these just different realities, unless we get out of the media bubbles we're in and look for what actually happened.
So you think that algorithmic hypnosis plays a factor here as far as like media echo chambers controlling people's minds and taking them away from the truth?
Yeah, it's not helping, right? Because everybody feels the very moment when all of us should step back and take pause, everybody just feels even more justified for whatever it is they believe. And you look at, I mean, Mike Lee of Utah, right, U.S. Senator, mocking the assassination of Melissa Hortman because he imagined that this was somehow something he could use against Democrats, shows you that this isn't just like, somebody in their basement like reading the wrong Twitter accounts. This is really important, influential people who have had their own psychologies warped by the algorithm.
On the inverse, how do you feel about all the people losing their jobs and stuff like that for mocking the assassination of Charlie Kirk, or celebrating it rather?
Well, look, celebrating it is wrong. And I think that there is a whole spectrum of responses, right? From ones that would make, I think, any employer think, wait a minute, like, do I have a violent person on my team, through to people who phrase something the wrong way or express politics in a moment that was not the right moment. And not all of that means that you should be stifled. There's like thousands of reactions, but I think all of us should step back and just, again, agree on some basic things here, that political violence is wrong, perpetrating it is wrong, celebrating it is wrong, and trying to exploit it is wrong.
Right. But do you think it's justified for employers to terminate employees who have said things like, oh, he got what's coming to him, or something like that?
Look, again, I think there's a lot of different cases, but I think just because somebody was an asshole on Twitter doesn't automatically mean they ought to lose their job.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much for your time once again. I appreciate you making time for this follow-up, and we'll definitely be in touch. Should release this probably sometime this week, and I think that it'll be pretty well received.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me in.
Yeah,
Enjoyed
of course,
it. Good luck in your travels.
Yeah, talk to y'all soon. Bye.
Take care.
He was recording on his own video, right?
In 1999, the German newspaper Die Zeit ran an experiment. They asked a falafel salesman and former theater director, Salah Bengali, who in the world he would most like to be connected to. He chose his favorite actor, Marlon Brando. So the reporters then searched for a chain of friends, family, or acquaintances, people who knew each other on a first-name basis, who could connect Bengali to Brando. As it happens, Bengali had a friend in California. This friend worked alongside the boyfriend of a woman who was the sorority sister of the daughter of the producer of the film Don Juan DeMarco, starring Marlon Brando. So in total, it took just 6 steps, 6 degrees of separation. And the idea is that this is not a unique example, that you could connect any 2 people on the planet in 6 steps or less. But is it really true? And if it is, how does it affect our lives?
How is this possible in a world of now 8 billion people, that we could be that close, just 6 hops or less? Does that affect how diseases spread, how information travels? Our math showed the question is not why is the world small, it's really how could it be otherwise? But then I got a call from the FBI. We are making the world smaller all the time. Like it's supposed to be good, and yet it does expose you to toxicity and malevolence that you might have been shielded from.
You look at the net effect of it, and it's actually been pretty negative by a lot of measures. People have suffered.
It's not only dangerous in terms of disease propagation, but anything malevolent now has conduits that it didn't used to have.
If we were all connected to everyone else on the planet completely at random, then it would be almost a mathematical certainty that any 2 of us would be connected through fewer than 6 steps.
Let's suppose I have my 100 friends out of 8 billion people. Each of them knows 100 people. So 2 steps away from me is going to encompass 100 times 100 people. That's already 10 to the 4th people. And so if you do 100 to the 5th power, that's 10 to the 10th. And that's more people than there are on Earth. So notice that number is 5. I said to the 5th power. That's the ballpark reason why 6 degrees of separation is true.
But the shocking thing about this is the calculation you've just outlined is about having 100 friends at random out of 10 billion, and they're all over the world. But we know that in the real world, that's nowhere near what the distribution of friends are like.
Absolutely true. So this really crude calculation I did is absurd for the reason that you said. The world is very far from random.
The truth is, people naturally cluster geographically. Most of the people you know live close to you, and they also have a higher probability of knowing each other. If you calculate the fraction of people you know who also know each other, that is a measure of the clustering in the network. So let's try a model with a high degree of clustering. Imagine all 8 billion people on Earth are arranged into a circle, and say each person knows the 100 people closest to them, so 50 to the left and 50 to the right. Well, in this case, the furthest person you can connect to is just 50 people away. So if you wanted to connect to someone on the other side of the planet through a chain of people who know each other, well, it would take 80 million steps. And to connect any 2 people would take on average 40 million steps. Even just getting 10% of the way there would take 8 million steps, and 6 steps would get you, well, here. This is the paradox of 6 degrees of separation. We know that we live in these local clusters of friends and acquaintances, but we also seem to be able to connect anyone anywhere in just 6 steps. 10 years ago, I did my own experiment on this, and I found that the average Veritasium viewer was only 2.7 degrees of separation from me. In social science, this is known as the small world problem, named after the phenomenon where you're, say, on holiday somewhere, and you bump into a stranger who somehow knows your best friend, and you say, wow, it's such a small world. In the mid-1990s, 2 mathematicians, Duncan Watts and Steve Strogatz, set out to solve this small world problem.
Duncan really sort of had very far-seeing imagination at that point.
We had computers that allowed us to simulate environments that were too complicated for math to work.
Up until then, physicists had studied networks that were ordered and regular, like crystal lattices. And mathematicians like Paul Erdos had done lots of work on totally random networks. But no one had studied what happens in between.
There must be some enormous middle ground, And that's what Duncan and I felt like we're starting to explore.
To study this middle ground, Watts and Strogatz imagined a simple, regular network of people, or nodes, dotted around a circle, each connected to a few of their nearest neighbors.
And so we had this idea, we're going to start with the physicist end of regular, and now we're going to turn the randomness knob to make it more and more random through these random shortcuts.
We all have some experience with shortcuts.
I belong to this club called the Internet Chess Club. I got to be very friendly with a guy in Holland. That connection makes the world small because now, even though my friends don't realize it, they're only one step away from a guy in Holland. And so that kind of connection, where you sort of connect to someone outside your normal circle, is what we came to call a shortcut.
So they went round the circle, disconnecting some of the links and reconnecting them at random to a different node in the network. And as they did that, they watched what happened to the average number of steps it took to get from any one node in the network to another, hopping between connected nodes. In other words, the degree of separation.
This is now the moment for the big reveal. As Duncan turned the knob in his computer simulations, as soon as he introduced a few shortcuts, the world immediately gets as small as a random graph.
When they had rewired just 1% of the links to shortcuts, the average degree of separation dropped from 50 in the original fully ordered network to 10. But Watts and Strogatz also tracked how clustered the network was. That's the fraction of a node's connections that are also connected to each other. Or in other words, the fraction of my friends who are also friends with each other. What they found is that clustering remained high for much longer.
The world immediately gets as small as a random graph. But it stays as clustered as if it were still regular. So you could simultaneously have the clustering that we know is real and the small world that we know is real.
Now, in Watts and Strogatz's model, they looked at 1,000 nodes. But if you apply their model to the 8 billion people on Earth, well, then you would only need 3 out of every 10,000 friendships to be a shortcut, and the average degrees of separation drops to 6.
Our math showed the question is not why is the world small, it's really how could it be otherwise? Duncan started saying to me, this is about discovering a whole new universe and its properties and laws. I recognized that he was right.
I just wanted to sort of reflect on what you said about these sort of shortcuts. I think I've had this phenomenon happen to me sometimes in my life where I'm sort of invited to an event and it seems like a very random event. Often I kind of feel like, oh, I don't really want to go, none of my friends are going. But then maybe at the last minute I just say like, well, let's just roll the dice. And I find that almost invariably those are productive meetings. I'm kind of wondering if there's a takeaway for people here, which is that they should put themselves in situations where the probability of forming these shortcut links, would it sort of increase the luck in your life?
You have just put your finger on a very famous phenomenon in sociology that is called the strength of weak ties. Because you ask people how they got their job. And people would say, oh yeah, I heard about it from, Randy. And then he'd say, oh, is Randy a friend of yours? And people invariably would say, no, he's an acquaintance. I wouldn't call him a friend, he's an acquaintance. That's a weak tie. The strong tie is your best friend or your circle of friends.
Excited about their breakthrough, Watts and Strogatz wanted to test their small world model on some real world data. But this was 1996.
We had to think, well, where are we going to get data on big networks where we could test this? And it was not so easy. The internet was not mapped out. Google didn't exist.
So they turned to an unusual source.
There was only one nervous system that had been mapped at that time, which was the worm C. elegans. Tiny worm, like a millimeter, that you can find in the dirt, a favorite of neurobiologists. They knew every cell in the body of C. elegans from the time it's a single cell till it becomes a whole organism. So they had the total wiring diagram of that organism.
Watts and Strogatz tested their model on the worm's neural network. The worm has precisely 282 neurons, and on average, they're connected to 14 others. If you lay that all out in a line along the worm's body, the neurons at the ends would be separated by around 40 steps, and the average degree of separation would be around 14. But when Watts and Strogatz ran the calculations, they found the average degrees of separation between any two neurons was just 2.65. To put that in context, if they were connected totally at random, it would be 2.25.
And yes, okay, so bingo, that was a small world. Then we were popping the champagne. I mean, that was really exciting that nature had done that. So then we thought, well, okay, but this should be true of lots of networks because nature can't resist this mechanism.
So they looked at Hollywood actors and power grids across the US. Sure enough, they were both small world networks. For example, in the database of over 200,000 Hollywood actors, the average degree of separation was less than 4.
Dangerfield was in Caddyshack with Bill Murray, and Bill Murray was in She's Having a Baby with Kevin Bacon.
Then the real payoff for us as people interested in dynamical systems, more than graph theory, was, okay, so what? So what if the world is small? Does that affect how things get in sync? Does it affect how diseases spread? Does it affect how information travels? Whatever. And so we did a number of experiments, again, in the computer like that.
Take disease. I wanted to know how a few shortcuts would affect how disease spreads through a network. So I asked Casper and the team to make a simulation.
And then the question to you is, do you want to start with a completely regular world where it's completely clustered, or do you want to start with completely random?
I would start with a regular world.
Okay. There it goes.
This is the spread of infections.
Yeah. So it takes over the world completely. Well, if every step was a day, it would take 73 days for the infection to take over this entire world.
Well, let's introduce a few shortcuts and see.
Okay. Let's make it small world, like 10%. Let's go.
Boom. Wow, that's really dramatic.
Right?
That's really dramatic and very fast.
Yeah, so fast. Yeah, after 26 days, the whole world.
And that ramp up does look exponential at the beginning, and then
it
kind of looks linear there as well, but it's almost like you can't go any faster.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's make it a completely random network.
Boom.
Boom.
Crazy. How many days now for a fully random network?
25.
Basically identical.
Which is crazy because in the random case, all your links are random. In the small world case, it's just 10%. It's like if 1 out of your 10 friends are a shortcut, which, for some people might be a bit much, but I reckon for you, it's probably about right.
Yeah, I got lots of shortcuts.
But the crazy thing is that in this simulation, we only used 100 nodes. And if you use the same model to the 8 billion people on Earth, then you would actually need less than 1% of all your links to be shortcuts.
In 1998, Watts and Strogatz published their findings in a 3-page article in Nature, and the paper took off. Within a few years, the paper already had hundreds of citations. By 2014, it was ranked the 63rd most cited paper of all time. And today, it's got around 58,000 citations. That's higher than Peter Higgs' paper on the Higgs boson and almost 3 times as many as Watson and Crick's Nobel Prize-winning paper on DNA.
So it's probably worth making that distinction, that citations are one measure of impact. We're cited a lot more than Einstein, and I think you know who's more important. It's not us, but it does mean people thought it was worth citing. We had many tens of thousands of citations from people in far-flung fields, from neuroscience to sociology to graph theory to computer science. Even, English literature, people would do things like draw networks between words.
Is there any irony in the fact that this paper on small word networks goes viral itself?
Yes, I think so, maybe so.
But then things got a little weird.
That's when I started getting some strange phone calls. I got a call from somebody at the FBI. I was a little scared, what's the FBI calling me about? And so I call back, and the person who picks up says, hair and fiber. I was calling the hair and fiber network at the FBI, the people who do, criminology based on what telltale hairs or fibers are left on the victim's clothes after they've been murdered. There was a guy who said, what happens when the police have a suspect and they say you have fibers on your sweater that match the hair of the victim? And then the defense lawyer says, well, maybe the victim was on a bus and left her fibers on the bus, and then my client sat on a secondary transfer, they would call it, of these fibers. That doesn't prove anything. So the FBI wanted to know what's the probability of secondary transfers compared to primary transfers from actually killing the person. And like, what do I know?
Now, that's a Steve Strogatz problem. For most of us, a random caller telling you they're an FBI agent is probably a scam. Chances are they got your number from a data leak or a data broker. Anytime you provide your name, phone number, even your social security number, that personal information can be scraped, packaged, and sold to anyone who will pay. And if criminals get hold of it, well, they can open credit card accounts in your name, or even use it to stalk or harass you. Fortunately, today's video sponsor, Incogni, can help. With your permission, they'll send out a letter to each broker using the correct legal terms and keep insisting until your data comes down. And remember, even one unremoved profile can be enough for criminals to target you. If you sign up to Incogni's unlimited plans, you can even flag public websites where your information appears with their custom removals tool. Their data agents will take care of the rest. Since I started using Incogni 18 months ago, they've filed almost 700 requests for me, and over 600 of those have been completed. With their unlimited family plan, you can protect your whole family too. So to keep your information safe, head over to incogni.com/Veritasium by clicking the link in the description, or just use this QR code. And when you do, be sure to use the code Veritasium for 60% off your annual subscription. So I want to thank Incogni for sponsoring this video, and now back to networks. In 1998, Albert Laszlo Barabashi was studying the internet. At that time, there were around 800 million web pages. But despite the web's enormous size, Barabashi found that on average, you could connect any two sites with just 19 clicks. Apparently, the web was a small world too. But the strange thing was, it didn't look anything like the small world network in Watts and Strogatz's model.
We ended up mapping out a region of the World Wide Web, and we had a very clear expectation of how that network should look like.
Barabashi thought the distribution of pages and links would resemble a bell curve, similar to what you'd get for people's height across a population. Most sites would have some average number of links, and there would be very few outliers either side. But that is not what he saw.
And so we measured the distribution, and it didn't look anything like what we expected.
The curve started out steep. Loads of websites had not many links. Then there was this really long tail.
And here we saw web pages that had not only a little more, but sometimes 100 times more links than the average degree or the average node on the website.
These were websites like Yahoo, superconnectors that linked to thousands of other sites. Barabashi called them hubs because when he mapped out the network, they resembled the hub of a wheel with spokes going out to hundreds of other pages. And it was these hubs that made the web a small world, not shortcuts. So Barabashi wondered, how could this apply to other networks too?
Most real networks, or virtually all large networks, follow two very fundamental principles. First, any large network out there never pops out as a large network, but it grows, right? You have a tiny World Wide Web in 1991, and now we have trillions of nodes on the World Wide Web. How did we get to 1 to a trillion? One node at a time, one website at a time. All the networks out there, no matter how old, how fast they emerged, they always emerge to some kind of growth process. So if you think about networks, you must build in that growth process. Number two, when a new node comes in, you join Facebook, who you're gonna connect to, right? And it is somewhat unpredictable, but it's biased. Your connections are always biased towards the more connected nodes, simply because you are more likely to know a more connected node than a less connected node. We named this process preferential attachment.
Barabashi reasoned that these two principles could explain how hubs naturally emerge when a network grows. So together with his colleague, Reika Albert, he ran a simulation.
We've also got a simulation for this. They started with a simple network of just a few connected nodes. Then they began adding new nodes to the network one at a time, with just one condition. They'd be more likely to connect to nodes that already had more links.
That's so cool. Looks very biological, very organic. Also, I like how the nodes come out and they don't just sort of stop in one spot. They kind of like wiggle around and like find their location. I really enjoy this. Like a space station.
That's what I was thinking.
Or like a space colony, right? Like the
Yeah,
Mars.
yeah, right? Like each little center one could be a planet, then you've got all the sort of stations going around it.
Yes.
So when Barabashi and Albert let these networks evolve, hubs emerged.
And we showed that growth and preferential attachment together naturally lead to the mergers of the hubs.
With this simulation, Barabashi and Albert showed how hubs could emerge in virtually any complex network. Take airports, for example. In 1955, Chicago O'Hare opened to commercial flights. Unlike neighboring airport Midway, it had long runways and plenty of space for new jet aircraft. Airlines began shifting service there. As more airlines connected flights to O'Hare, passengers had more options to connect, making it increasingly attractive. After deregulation in the 1970s, more airlines were free to add routes, and the feedback loop accelerated. Each new route made the airport more useful to passengers and more appealing to other airlines. Today, O'Hare is the most connected airport in the United States, with direct flights to well over 200 destinations.
But we don't just see hubs in man-made networks. In food webs, you have a few keystone species like Atlantic cod that connect hundreds of predators and prey. And in the metabolic networks in our cells, you have a few molecules like ATP that govern hundreds of chemical reactions. In the neural networks in our brain, you have a few regions, like the prefrontal cortex, that link hundreds of different functions. Now, as each of these networks evolved and grew over time, you had new species, new reactions, and new circuits that latched on to what was already well connected. And so you get this sort of natural growth. Now, preferential attachment isn't the only mechanism that can create hubs. There are plenty of other factors at play, particularly in these more complex biological systems. But what Barabashi's and Albert's simulation showed is that all it takes is a tiny bias when growing a network, and hubs end up being inevitable.
Once hubs are there, they fundamentally change the way the system behaves and the way we understand that system.
Hubs like O'Hare mean you can get pretty much anywhere in the world in just a few flights. But that connectivity also has consequences. In August 2025, thunderstorms shut down Chicago O'Hare, and 280 flights were canceled and 80 were diverted. Overflow hit at least 6 other US airports, while some planes stuck in Chicago never left for Europe or Asia.
Bad weather in Chicago totally changes not only the travel pattern in Chicago, but within 24 hours, the whole country is being affected by that.
And we see the same phenomenon.